Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. Not different like new hobby, different. More like, you probably won't survive this era if you don't give birth before your hips stop growing different. We're heading all the way back to the very beginning, to a time before your ancestors even had words for love, let alone the vocabulary for anything remotely close to pleasure. Think less feathered pillows, more moss and obligation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious, what city are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's not pitch black, but it's close. The air smells of dirt, sweat, and a bit of damp bark. Your feet are bare, and you're surrounded by figures who don't look particularly concerned with modesty. There's no concept of private parts here, because privacy itself hasn't been invented yet. You're somewhere in the late Paleolithic world, tens of thousands of years ago, and sex, as you know it, is just a series of coordinated biological rituals designed to keep the species going. No one's writing poetry about thighs or whispering sweet nothings. In fact, no one's whispering at all. The wind is louder than any spoken word. At this point in human history, you're basically a walking vessel of survival. Your community needs you, specifically your reproductive organs, to work properly. If you're a woman, your entire body has been designed to conceive, birth, and nourish. If you're a man, your job is to contribute your seed and help secure food to keep offspring alive, long enough to eventually do the same. Everyone's life expectancy is roughly the age you are now, give or take. The idea that you'd be intimate with someone because you felt a spark, that's adorable. But evolution is still driving this bus, and there are no detours for feelings. Still, just because it's functional doesn't mean it's joyless. You notice the way people touch one another, quick, efficient, but not cold. There's an undercurrent of connection, even if it's not romantic. And there are ceremonies too. Around the fire, older members of the group sometimes hum or paint symbols onto stones, shapes that to your modern eye vaguely resemble wombs or seeds. This is the earliest whisper of something sacred. A vague realization that the act of creating life might mean something more than just propagating DNA. Now, let's talk about the gods. Because even though organized religion is still a twinkle in the cosmic eye, early humans are already spiritual. They look to the moon and stars and see patterns. They watch animals mating and giving birth, and they mimic them. Some groups even wear animal hides or horns during fertility rites, believing these will bring stronger offspring. Sex isn't for pleasure, but it is beginning to take on meaning. Cosmic meaning. It's not about how it feels, but about what it does. Here's the twist. In many early tribal societies, sex isn't shameful. It's neutral, even sacred. No one's slapping hands away or inventing dress codes. Nakedness isn't scandalous. It's Tuesday. Your body isn't a source of pride or embarrassment. It's just part of the landscape. Children witness acts of reproduction without taboo, because they have to understand it to survive. And strangely, this openness doesn't lead to chaos, it leads to clarity. When everyone knows the rules, no one has to whisper. There's a fascinating fringe theory among some anthropologists that early human societies may have practiced communal parenting. That is, no one really knew whose child was whose, and that was kind of the point. In these systems, sex happened frequently, not tied to strict monogamous pairs, and offspring were raised collectively. The goal wasn't pleasure, it was distribution of risk. If all the adults are caregivers, no child is orphaned by a hunting accident or infection. It's not romantic, but it's undeniably efficient. Now, let's sprinkle in a little mystery, shall we? Deep in a cave system in modern-day France, archaeologists discovered a series of handprints and depictions of human figures that suggest early humans had rituals connected to fertility. What's debated is whether these rituals involved physical intimacy or symbolic representations of it. Some believe shamans performed ceremonial spiritual unions with fertility goddesses, or at least what they thought were goddesses. Others think these were simply early versions of puberty rites, awkward, terrifying, and crucial. So yeah, imagine your worst health class nightmare, but with more smoke and bare fat. From a modern standpoint, this era looks painfully utilitarian, but from theirs, it was profound. Life and death were neighbours, childbirth could kill, and failed crops meant famine. Pleasure was a luxury few could afford, and frankly, most didn't even know they were missing it. You didn't ask whether something made you happy, you asked whether it kept the fire burning and your stomach full. If it did, you did it again. So here you are, breathing the smoke of a communal fire, watching a girl no older than 15 be paired with a boy who's just learned to throw a spear. Their union isn't celebrated with music or tears, but with nods and shared tasks. They'll build a shelter together. She'll grow a belly. If they're lucky, the baby will live long enough to learn to hunt. There is no pleasure as we understand it, just the slow, grinding engine of life continuing. And yet, even here, in this raw landscape, something is stirring. A look held too long, a touch that lingers just a second more than it needs to. Maybe it's not pleasure, but maybe it's the first flickering shadow of it. A seed, not yet sprouted, buried under layers of duty, survival and bone. You wake to the sound of rustling leaves and animal calls echoing through the trees. The air is thick with moisture, and your limbs ache from the hard-packed ground. You're deep in a prehistoric forest now, somewhere between the invention of basic tools and the earliest attempts at language. There are no names here, only grunts, gestures, and instinct. And here, you realise something strange. Sex doesn't belong to humans. It never did. Before language, before fire, before myth, mating existed in every living thing that crawled, slithered, flew, or sprinted across this world. You're not special. Not yet. This isn't the romantic wilderness you see in oil paintings or daydreams. It's survival. Constant, brutal, sensory overloading survival. Your neighbours are animals. Some with massive tusks, some with claws longer than your forearms. You watch them in the wild and realise they're mating too, but not like people. It's fast, violent, mechanical. One moment, the act is happening, the next, it's over. No cuddling, no flirting, just the cold efficiency of passing on genes. And strangely, this raw biological drive is where human sexuality begins. Not in love, not in lust, but in imitation. You hunker down near a riverbed and watch a pair of early hominins, probably Homo erectus, maybe Homo habilis. They don't see you. They don't even see each other in the way you might hope. She's crouched, looking away. He approaches from behind, quick, silent. The entire thing lasts seconds. No eye contact, no conversation, just motion. Then it's over. She walks away without a backward glance. This is mating stripped of anything sentimental. This is what it looked like before the invention of even the idea of pleasure. And yet, even here, you feel the stirrings of change. These early humans are more than animals. They've learned to use tools to carry food back to a central place. They recognise each other. There's a hierarchy emerging. Dominant males might control access to multiple females. Lower-ranking ones might be exiled entirely. But every now and then, when the alpha turns his back, the lower-ranking males sneak opportunities. It's risky, it's dangerous, and it's a spark of something that looks a lot like desire. Here's the historical fact. Early human mating strategies were deeply influenced by animal behaviour, but our growing brains began to twist those instincts into something more social, and occasionally more strategic. Recent theories suggest that early males competed not just physically but emotionally, learning to read the needs of potential partners, offer food, protect their young. These weren't flowers or love notes, but they were the earliest prototypes of courtship. You bring meat, you get chosen. That's simple. And then there's the fringe theory that might make you raise an eyebrow. Some anthropologists believe that certain early humans may have developed seasonal orgies tied to migration patterns or food availability. No, really. It wasn't about pleasure. Don't get excited. It was about synchronizing reproduction, ensuring that births happened when resources were most plentiful. Picture this. An entire tribe suddenly engaged in synchronized, ritualized coupling because the salmon are running upstream and berries are finally in bloom. It sounds wild, but from an evolutionary standpoint it tracks. Efficiency over ecstasy. Always. But here's where things get murky. Scholars still argue over whether our early ancestors experienced sexual attraction in any way we'd recognise. Did they feel longing? Was there chemistry? Or was it all just biological urges acting like tides, coming and going without reason or regret? Some say pleasure was always there, buried under layers of necessity. Others think it only came much later, once survival stopped being a full-time job, Either way, you're in the thick of it now, watching the line blur between instinct and intention. The smells here are overwhelming. Smoke from a distant fire, the metallic scent of blood from a recent hunt, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. But none of it bothers you. These people don't have mirrors, don't measure beauty the way you do. There's no concept of attractive versus unattractive. There's healthy and there's dying. If your limbs move well, your skin isn't covered in sores, and you can chew meat without help, you're desirable, or at least useful, and usefulness matters. You see a woman, broad-shouldered and quick-footed, being followed by two males. One carries a dead hare, the other an armful of wood. She glances at them, expression unreadable. Later, she chooses one and shares her food. That's it. No words, no promises. But in this world, a shared meal is a binding agreement. It's the beginning of something that might eventually resemble a partnership, or a power play. The spark of relationship still without romance. At night, the group huddles close for warmth, and you begin to notice something different. The pairs that sleep nearest the fire often include an older female and a younger male, or the reverse. You watch as hands move gently, not urgently. There's no thrusting, no gasps of ecstasy, but there is tenderness, quiet presence, companionship. Is this love? Not exactly. But it's something more than mating. A step closer to the emotional entanglements you know, and that step matters. In the quiet hours before dawn, someone begins to hum. It's not a song, more of a rhythm. The others shift, murmur, respond. The next day, you see them gathering near a patch of flowering plants, rubbing the petals on their bodies. Is it decoration? Camouflage? A ritual? No one can say. But maybe, just maybe, it's proto-seduction. Not about sex itself, but about being seen. The roots of beauty. The early soil where pleasure might eventually bloom. So here you are, sitting in the mud with your prehistoric cousins, watching a version of intimacy you barely recognize. It's not about what feels good, it's about what works. And yet, beneath the grime and the growling stomachs, you can't help but feel the undercurrent of something else. Something ancient and slow-moving like a tectonic plate. The earliest hints of attraction, of longing, of curiosity. Not pleasure, not yet, but the idea of it, lurking just below the surface. You wake again, this time with soot in your nose and the faint sting of herbs burning on the wind. The forest is behind you now, replaced by a clearing dotted with stone and earth mounds, the earliest architecture your feet have ever touched. Civilization is still shy, still learning to crawl, but you're in the midst of the Neolithic revolution. When humans finally decided that chasing animals was exhausting, and maybe planting a few seeds wouldn't be the worst idea. You've landed smack in the middle of a world that's discovering fire, farming, and something entirely new, the ritual. At first glance, the people look like any other small tribe. Clay-streaked skin, animal hide tunics, rough hair. But their behaviour is different, deliberate, symbolic. You see a group gathered in a circle, humming low, rhythmic chants while a central figure, adorned in feathers and a heavy necklace made of animal teeth, begins tracing patterns in the dirt. These aren't random scratches. You recognise the symbols, spirals, crosses, seed-like ovals. These are fertility symbols. You've walked into a ceremony, and it's not about love, it's about survival, again. But now survival is getting dressed up for the occasion. This is the birth of sacred sexuality, and no one here is joking about it. The act of reproduction has become mythologized. It's not just something that happens, it's something that must be performed correctly to ensure crops grow, rain falls, and babies live. The woman at the centre of the circle lifts her arms, painted red with ochre, and begins a slow, rhythmic dance. You can't tell if it's beautiful or eerie, maybe both. The people chant louder, pressing their hands to the ground, as if planting more than just seeds. In this world, sex is agriculture, and fertility belongs to the cosmos. This might be a good time to tell you about the goddess, because in this age she's everywhere, carved into stone, painted on cave walls, etched into pottery. Her hips are wide, her breasts heavy, her face nearly featureless. She isn't a beauty standard, she's a force. The Venus figurines you've heard about, those aren't primitive pin-ups, they're symbols of life-giving power. In many Neolithic cultures, the feminine form wasn't about attraction, it was about abundance. The bigger the body, the more powerful the magic. Want a good harvest? Appease the goddess. Want your goats to give birth? build a shrine with her curves. Here's the historical fact. Early agrarian societies often centred around fertility cults. These weren't sex cults, not in the way your YouTube history might suggest, but deeply spiritual communities that tied human reproduction to cosmic cycles. People believed that if they mirrored the union of sky and earth through ritualized acts of intimacy, they could influence the natural world. It wasn't about anyone enjoying the act, it was about keeping the seasons turning. The fringe fact. Some historians argue that these fertility rites may have included group sex, or more accurately group enactments of symbolic union, where chosen participants represented divine forces. Imagine being the village's sacred couple for the season. You're not hooking up, you're reenacting the creation of life itself, sometimes in front of the entire community. No pressure, you're not even supposed to enjoy it. If anything, personal pleasure might ruin the ritual's purity. It's theatre, not romance. And that leads us to the open scholarly debate. Were these rituals actually sexual acts, or purely symbolic? Some archaeologists argue that what we interpret as sexual symbolism, phallic stones, yoni-shaped carvings, intertwined figures, could have had entirely different meanings. Maybe they were about growth, or protection, or even death and rebirth. Others say we're overthinking it, that ancient people knew exactly what they were doing when they carved that rock into a 12-foot stone penis. Either way, you're seeing the world take its first awkward steps towards sacred sensuality. You follow a group into a small temple, a structure made of piled stone and thatch, dark and cool inside. The walls are covered in ochre designs, and the floor is packed earth, smoothed by generations of feet. In the centre lies a stone slab stained darker than the rest. No one explains it, but you get the sense this is where the ritual happens. Not all the time, not casually, but in moments of crisis or celebration. A poor harvest, a stillbirth, a wedding. Here, sex is not personal, it's performative, even sacrificial. The bodies involved aren't just themselves, they're vessels for bigger forces, rain gods, earth mothers, cosmic unions. You find yourself standing beside a young girl, maybe 13, with heavy beads around her neck and her hair braided with wildflowers. She's being painted by two older women with thick, muddy pigment. Her face is expressionless. You watch the ceremony unfold with an uncomfortable awareness. This isn't about her feelings. No one's asking if she's in love. She's been chosen, perhaps born into it, perhaps selected by signs, and that's all that matters. You want to intervene, but in this world autonomy doesn't exist. There's no yes or no, only roles to be played and rituals to complete. Later you walk among the fields, where small plots of barley and lentils are just beginning to rise. A couple tends to them, quiet, cooperative. They might be partners, or they might have simply been paired for planting. It's impossible to know. What's clear is that their intimacy isn't about butterflies in the stomach. It's about survival strategies, division of labour, child-rearing efficiency. But now, something subtle is shifting. One of them pauses, leans into the other's shoulder. Not sexual, not romantic, just familiar, comfortable. Could this be the beginning of affection? Not lust, not ritual, but a kind of closeness rooted in years spent side by side. You think it might be. As night falls again, the fire is lit not just for warmth, but for gathering. You sit on a log, listening to stories told in rhythmic, broken syllables, accompanied by gestures. You realise these stories are about ancestors, how they met, how they created, how they sacrificed. None of them talk about passion, but some of them sound suspiciously like love stories, if you squint hard enough. A woman who waited 3 winters for a man to return from the mountains, a man who built a second hut for his wife's sister when she was widowed. These aren't myths, they're memories, and in them you catch the distant echo of emotion. So here you are, in a world that sees sex as a cosmic event, a field to be tended, a debt to the gods. There is no pleasure in the act, but there is pride, there is duty, and now, just barely, there's also a faint tug of something new. A gentleness that doesn't serve a purpose, a glance that doesn't mean anything but somehow still matters. It's small, it's fragile, but it's there. You blink and the landscape shifts again. Fields flatten into plains and those little clustered huts have evolved into something sturdier. Mud brick walls, defined streets, raised altars. You're no longer in scattered villages. You're standing at the edge of something massive, humming with early civilization. This is the Bronze Age, and right now you're in the Fertile Crescent, caught between rivers that flood and feed the first great city-states. If you listen closely, you'll hear the earliest laws being etched into stone and the sound of temples rising, where gods, kings and sex all blur into one complicated performance. The first thing you notice is how busy it is. There are markets and priests, scribes and soldiers. People no longer drift through life in loose kin groups. They have jobs, debts, gods to appease, and very clear social roles. And sex? Oh, it's still here. But it's changing again. It's starting to live in contracts and altars, in power dynamics and property rights. You walk through the city of Ur, or maybe Babylon, and you see inscriptions carved in cuneiform, the earliest written language, that say things like, "If a man sleeps with a virgin, he must pay her father." Welcome to bureaucracy. It's here to stay. You pass by a ziggurat, a towering layered temple that looks like a staircase for giants. Inside, veiled women move quietly through incense-thick chambers, wearing gold-threaded robes and anklets that jingle with each step. These are sacred women, sometimes called priestesses, sometimes temple prostitutes, though the line between the two is blurrier than anyone today is comfortable admitting. They don't seduce, they serve. Some Mesopotamian temples included sexual rites, rituals believed to please the gods or mirror divine unions. You're watching the city elevate the act of sex to something half divine, half civil obligation. It's a transaction, yes, but it's also sacred performance. Here's your historical fact. Many ancient cities featured temples dedicated to fertility deities like Inanna or Ishtar, where ritual sex wasn't seen as sinful or shameful. It was part of honouring the divine. The act wasn't about personal desire, it was about maintaining cosmic balance, invoking the goddess's favour, and reinforcing the idea that sex served a higher purpose than individual pleasure. Now let's throw in a quirky fringe theory. Some scholars argue that these sacred rites may have involved entire festivals, where citizens engaged in public displays of intimacy, mimicking divine copulation. Not orgies for fun, calm down, but structured sacred events meant to stimulate prosperity. Crops would grow if humans performed their part, but no one was bringing wine and scented candles. There's still no concept of pleasure as something you're entitled to. It's ritual, not recreation. The scholarly debate here is spicy and still unresolved. Were these temple rituals truly sexual acts between humans, or symbolic rites misinterpreted by later historians? Some believe sacred prostitution is a modern myth, a mistranslation of temple service roles. Others insist the ancients knew exactly what they were doing, and that these acts were accepted, even revered. What's certain is this. In these societies, sex is increasingly being pulled into the domain of religion and state, which means rules are being written, and wherever there are rules, there's hierarchy. You walk into a modest household, a man and his 2 wives, 3 children, a slave girl. The wives manage the weaving, the slave tends the fire. The man is respected in the community and owns land, which means he's allowed to take more than one partner. The wives speak little when he enters. At night he chooses which room to enter. There's no discussion. His word is law, and law is now a written thing. Love, if it exists here, is entirely optional. You find a stack of clay tablets, early legal codes, and skim over the lines. If a wife is barren, her husband may sleep with her handmaid. If a man lies with another man's wife, he must be punished. If a woman refuses her conjugal duties, she may be divorced. The state is watching, and your body is now evidence. Pleasure? Still not invited. Sex is legal terrain, a battlefield of heirs and honour. But something strange happens when the sun goes down. In the city square, music begins to rise. Flutes, lyres, chanting. You see young people dancing, laughing, moving more freely than the day allows. You follow them to the edge of town where torches flicker near the riverbank. There's wine here and rhythm and flirtation, something playful and electric. For once, the act of touch isn't pre-approved by temple or law. It's impulsive, maybe even reckless. You're seeing the earliest rebellion, the first time someone looks at another and thinks I want, not I must or I should. And that's where the crack begins to show. Because even within these rigid systems, there's always someone who wants more than function, who craves warmth, intimacy, pleasure, whatever they can sneak in under the surface. A merchant's daughter and a labourer's son meeting in secret. A priestess who stays behind in the sanctuary a little longer than required. You hear their voices in the earliest love poems, like those carved in clay from Sumer. Bridegroom, dear to my heart, your sweet honey is on your lips. It's not porn, it's devotion, maybe even lust, written in a world that doesn't yet know what to do with it. But pleasure, as a rite, still doesn't exist. If it shows up, it's by accident. The gods must be pleased first, the lineage must be preserved, and your worth, especially if you're a woman, is tied tightly to how well your womb performs. You're a vessel, a gatekeeper, a name-bearer. You're not in any official capacity a person who gets to want. Still, as you walk past another shrine to Ishtar, you notice a tiny carving at the base. A figure leaning into another, their arms tangled in a way that feels tender. Not divine, not political, just human. Maybe a sculptor snuck it in as a joke, or maybe, just maybe, it was a confession, a whisper carved in stone. We did this for us, not for the gods. You step out of the shadow of Mesopotamian temples and into a soft, sun-washed landscape, thick with olive trees and open skies. Birds chirp over whitewashed stone and small clay shrines tucked into hillside nooks. You're in a world that smells of salt and rosemary, where everything, love, war, death, and yes, sex, is somehow both elegant and absurd. Welcome to the age of the goddess, not a goddess. The goddess in all her glorious, terrifying, many-breasted, snake-wielding incarnations. You've landed in the Eastern Mediterranean, in a time when matriarchal religion still holds sway, and divine femininity doesn't just rule, it bleeds into every corner of life. You walk through a Minoan village on the island of Crete, where bright frescoes decorate smooth stone walls. Women appear in art with exposed breasts and elaborate skirts, mid-dance or mid-blessing, faces calm, hands outstretched. There's a kind of sacred ease here, a celebration of fertility not just as function but as aesthetic. In this society, the body, especially the female body, isn't hidden or feared. It's revered. You see it in the priestess standing tall over a bull sacrifice, and in the fertility charms hanging from doorways. There's no shame in curves, in sweat, in creation. But don't mistake reverence for indulgence. This isn't about you feeling good. It's about the goddess being honoured. And that goddess, she's not exactly the cuddly type. She's got 10 names and 100 forms. Some are nurturing, fig tree, birth giver, sea foam. Others are dark, serpent queen, bone grinder, war midwife. She's a walking contradiction, a deity who blesses crops one day and unleashes storms the next. Her domain is creation and destruction, and to serve her, your body must obey. You attend a ceremony in her honour, where couples, sometimes strangers, sometimes paired by priestesses, reenact the sacred union between the goddess and her consort. It's theatrical, choreographed. The woman leads, always. Here's your historical fact. In Minoan and pre-Hellenic cultures, depictions of female-centered ritual life abound. Archaeological evidence suggests that women held powerful positions in religion and public ceremonies. Unlike later Greek societies that prioritized male dominance, these early Mediterranean civilizations placed women, and by extension female sexuality, at the center of divine power. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about access to the goddess, who often acted through women's bodies. Fringe theory incoming. There's a camp of scholars who argue that these goddess cults were part of a broader matriarchal world order, long before patriarchy took over. Some claim that before warlords and kings stamped their names on everything, the earth itself was worshipped as a mother, and her priestesses wielded enormous spiritual and even sexual authority. Their bodies weren't objects of desire, they were conduits of cosmic will. Did that mean pleasure was forbidden? Not exactly. But it wasn't the point. You didn't enjoy sex with the goddess, you survived it. That brings us to the debate. Was this truly matriarchal power, or just a different flavour of control? Some historians believe these ancient systems elevated women only within tightly regulated roles, priestess, mother, oracle, while still limiting their agency. Others argue that there really was a time when sexual and spiritual power rested in female hands, and that the later rise of male-dominated pantheons was a deliberate overthrow. One thing's clear. In these goddess-worshipping societies, the act of sex was loaded with meaning, and pleasure, if it came, was secondary to purpose. You sit at the edge of a sacred grove watching young girls drape garlands over stone idols, their fingers stained with crushed petals and honey. A priestess instructs them in chants, nothing coercive, but still heavy with expectation. These girls will one day participate in the sacred rites of union, just like their mothers. There's no word for virgin here, not the way later cultures will use it. A woman's worth isn't in what she hasn't done, but in how well she serves the divine cycle. It's a different kind of pressure, but it's pressure all the same. Later that night you follow a line of robed figures to a cave lit with oil lamps. Inside, incense burns thick and sweet. A ritual unfolds. A man stands before a veiled woman. He bows. She touches his forehead. They recite memorized lines, their voices slow and steady. The onlookers don't cheer, don't leer. This isn't entertainment. It's serious, sacred business. The act they're about to perform isn't theirs. It belongs to the goddess. They offer it like bread or wine. Whether it feels good doesn't matter. Whether it's remembered even doesn't matter. What matters is that it's done correctly, with reverence. This is sex as sacrament. But even in this highly ritualized world, the human heart won't stay quiet. You overhear two young initiates whispering behind a clay wall, laughing, blushing. One reaches out to touch the other's arm, and it's clumsy, shy. You realize this isn't a ceremony. This is curiosity, affection. Maybe even affection for its own sake. It's the tiniest spark of rebellion against divine programming, and it's happening in secret, as always. The temple walls may celebrate union, but not your union. They don't care who you long for or what makes your pulse quicken. The carvings show cosmic truths, not private pleasures. The stories are about gods making love to goddesses, the sea impregnating the earth, the sun chasing the moon, not about two teenagers brushing knees under a fig tree. And yet, under all this formality, there's a whisper, a current, something real and messy that wants to exist outside of symbolism, something that wants to feel good, not just sacred. You sit alone on a carved stone bench as night creeps across the hills, thinking about how far you've come. From caves to cities, from survival to ritual. You've seen sex used as survival tactic, sacred rite, legal contract and agricultural insurance. But never, not once, has it been just for you, or them, or anyone. Not yet. The world isn't ready. It still belongs to the gods. But if you squint, if you listen carefully, you'll catch it in the quiet moments. The giggle behind the olive press. The extra hand squeeze when no one's looking. The glance held just a second too long. Pleasure is coming. It's not here yet, but it's on its way. Like a storm building behind the mountains. The sun rises hotter here. Dust sticks to your skin as you step into a world carved from limestone and limestone-coloured ambition. You're in ancient Egypt now, where sex isn't just sacred or functional, it's something else entirely. Dynastic. This isn't a society that's hiding behind fig leaves or pretending bodies don't exist. In fact, it's probably the most open yet. The people here have no shame around nudity, no tittering behind fans. But before you get too comfortable, remember this. It's not about pleasure. Not yet. You're in a land where every body belongs to the state, and every climax to the continuation of divine rule. You follow the Nile, winding past papyrus groves and golden tombs, and find yourself in a palace courtyard. Pharaoh's wives sit in the shade, being fanned by attendants. They're beautiful, yes, but their beauty is strategic. These women weren't selected for their charm. They were chosen for their bloodlines, their family alliances, and their potential womb real estate. The pharaoh, you see, isn't just a man. He's a god in human form, and gods must produce heirs, preferably lots of them, and preferably male. You're not watching love stories unfold here. You're watching empire maintenance in action. Inside the palace walls, there's no privacy. Servants stand by as couples are paired off, sometimes even during the act, to ensure the appropriate rituals are followed. Offerings are made, incantations whispered, fertility statues stroked for luck. The goal is never intimacy, it's lineage. Every union is about securing the future of Egypt, about keeping the blood of Horus running through the veins of the next ruler. And yes, that includes siblings. The royal family is infamous for its intra-family pairings, not because they didn't know better, but because they believed divine blood should never mingle with the merely human. Here's your historical fact. Pharaohs frequently married their sisters or half-sisters to reinforce their divine status. This wasn't fringe, it was formal. The closer the couple was by blood, the more pure the lineage. To us it sounds like a social horror story. To them, it was an echo of the gods' own unions, Osiris and Isis for instance, who were both siblings and lovers in mythology. And if you're thinking that ancient Egypt was all incense and awkward palace hookups, don't worry. There's more. Among the common people, sex had a slightly looser vibe. Farmers and artisans could marry for affection, and while love wasn't always the reason, you do find hints of it in the poems scribbled on potsherds and tomb walls. There's even a bit of humour in their art. Lovers tangled in odd positions, animals mating awkwardly, and the occasional cheeky hieroglyph that leaves little to the imagination. Egyptians weren't prudish, but they weren't modern either. Fringe fact time. Some Egyptologists believe the infamous Turin erotic papyrus, basically an ancient scroll of highly graphic images, was a parody, not pornography. It may have been created to mock or satirise the excesses of the elite, or to playfully riff on sexual taboos. Either way, it's one of the rare examples from the ancient world where sex seems less about ritual and more about sheer human absurdity. For once, someone might have been drawing those figures just for fun. Still, debates continue. Did ancient Egyptians experience pleasure as we understand it? Or were their rituals and writings simply reflections of duty, fertility, and cosmic order? Some scholars argue that romantic affection did exist, hidden in metaphors and euphemism, like the man who writes, "My beloved's voice is sweet, her lips are lotus blossoms." Others insist this is us projecting backwards, trying to force ancient expressions into our modern mould. It's hard to say for sure, but those lotus lips, they definitely sound like someone was trying to flirt. You pass by a funeral procession, music low and rhythmic. The body being honoured is a young woman, clearly important. As the priests chant, her husband places offerings at her feet. Combs, perfume, a small statue of a cat. You don't need a translator to feel the emotion here. He's not just performing a rite, he's mourning, and not just for a political loss. His eyes are red, and his hands shake. It's the first time in a while that you see real, raw grief tied to love. You wonder if she was chosen for him, or if they chose each other. If somehow, against all odds, they found joy in their union. Later, in a small village by the river, you see something different. A young couple, unmarried, stealing time together near the reeds. They're laughing, swatting at mosquitoes, fingers brushing. There's no priest nearby, no family watching. Just two people with time to be awkward, maybe even curious. This too is rare. Not unheard of, but rare enough to feel like a miracle. Even now, sex is a privilege of control. If you're elite, it's about heirs. If you're poor, it's about survival. And if you're lucky, maybe, you get to want someone. Even the gods don't escape duty. In myths, Isis resurrects Osiris after he's murdered and reassembles his body, minus one key piece, if you catch my drift. She fashions a replacement out of gold and conceives Horus from it. Symbolic, definitely. Romantic, not especially. But it's another example of how sexual acts in mythology aren't about passion. They're about restoration, power, legacy. The erotic is divine, but never self-indulgent. You rest at the river's edge, the water cool against your feet. Fishermen call to one another, children splash nearby. Life here is hard, hot, beautiful. And even though no one talks about sex as pleasure, you sense its presence, soft, hidden, like silt on the bottom of the Nile, not yet at the surface, but gathering, waiting. Because even here, in this world of dynasties and divine mandates, people are still people, and people, eventually, start to wonder what it might be like to feel good just because it feels good. But that's still a dangerous question. You follow the river's flow until it pulls you east, into lands where reeds are swapped for sandier earth, and the temples are shorter but no less sacred. The language is sharper now, scratched into clay and angled strokes, and the people walk with a kind of anxious purpose, as if even their gods might show up with a scroll of rules and a reed stylus. You've arrived in ancient Mesopotamia again, but this time deeper inside its thick administrative heart. Babylon, Uruk, Nippur, cities with walls, ziggurats, taxes, and a bureaucracy that's managed to reach even into the bedroom. Sex here has been officially documented. It's not just talked about, it's recorded, listed, categorized. You're reading contracts written in cuneiform, etched into tablets and tucked into libraries. They outline obligations. A husband must provide food and shelter. A wife must be available on certain days. There are penalties for disobedience, fines for adultery, clauses for infertility. You aren't just watching relationships, you're watching transactions. A marriage is not love, it's a legal agreement, and sex is one of the terms. But before you get disheartened, consider this. These laws didn't come from nowhere. They came from the slow evolution of people trying to build something lasting, stable, structured. And sex, unruly as it is, needed taming, at least in the eyes of those who held the styluses. You sit in a scribe's courtyard, watching a young boy practice writing the phrase, "if a man," over and over again. His tablet includes a line about sleeping with a slave, another about virgin daughters, and yet another about temple women. Sex here is not sacred anymore, it's civic. Your historical fact. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known law codes, circa 1754 BCE, includes detailed rules about sexual conduct, including punishments for incest, adultery, and various forms of assault. While the code leans heavily in favour of male authority, it also provides some protections for women, mainly to preserve social order and prevent disputes that might disrupt inheritance or alliances. Now for the oddball detail you didn't ask for. In some Mesopotamian city-states, brides were expected to present a bloodied cloth after their wedding night to prove their virginity, a public display of a private act. But here's the twist. There were also women employed to fake these cloths, using sheep's blood or dye. That's right, the world's earliest sexual con artists may have worked in textiles. Let that one settle. The big debate among historians here. Whether the so-called temple prostitutes really existed in the way we imagine. For centuries it was assumed that certain women served in temples where sex was exchanged for offerings to the gods, especially the goddess Inanna or Ishtar, whose domains included both war and love. But modern scholarship is divided. Were these women sacred sex workers, priestesses, or merely symbolic figures misinterpreted by later, more prudish historians? The records are vague, the translations disputed, and the truth likely lost somewhere between incense and metaphor. Still, you can't deny the presence of these women in cultural memory. They appear in songs and poems, elevated, not shamed. One lyric recovered from a clay tablet reads, "You have captivated me. Let me stand trembling before you." It's not erotic in a modern sense, but it's charged, dripping with yearning. Someone at some point felt something more than obligation. Someone ached, and someone had the courage to write it down. You wander through a marketplace, dust clinging to your skin, the smell of dried dates and goat sweat thick in the air. A man tries to sell you a love charm, a small clay figure of a couple locked in an embrace. He says it will bring fertility, or affection, or both. He's vague. But you hold the figurine and can't help but think, whoever made this was imagining something beyond ritual or law. They were imagining intimacy, something that might even approach pleasure. Later, in a smaller home away from the temples and palaces, you witness a couple preparing for bed. No one's watching them. No priest, no scribe, just the hush of oil lamps and the creak of a reed mat. They don't speak much. They lie close. A hand brushes his back, not in passion, but in comfort. You realise that for most people, sex was never about gods or scrolls. It was about surviving the day and feeling a little less alone at night. Pleasure didn't have to be explosive. Sometimes it just meant not being cold. That's the part the law codes don't capture. They legislate the structure, who can do what to whom, and under which circumstances, but they don't account for the warm, clumsy, accidental ways people found each other. You imagine a husband slipping extra figs to a wife who makes him laugh, a woman sneaking to meet her lover in the orchard, a man feeling something stir when his hand accidentally brushes a stranger's wrist at the well. None of these moments are required. None are sacred, but they are real. Sex at this stage is completely entangled in hierarchy. A free man may sleep with a slave, and no one bats an eye. A slave who touches a free woman without permission could be maimed or killed. A wife who strays risks public punishment. A husband who strays risks only inconvenience. Bodies aren't equal. Desires aren't equal. The system is rigged. And yet, despite all that, people still steal glances, still sneak kisses, still write poems. You end your day seated beneath a fig tree, watching a group of young women learning to weave. Their laughter bubbles up like something outside the law's jurisdiction. One of them hums a tune that sounds suspiciously like a love song. Maybe it's new, maybe it's ancient, you'll never know. But you do know this: for all the ways sex has been used, as a tool, a duty, a law, it continues to slip through the cracks as something stubbornly human. It still wants to be more than assigned, it still wants to feel, and just maybe, for the first time it's starting to, you step out of the dust and laws of Babylon and into a softer, quieter place. A garden, maybe, or a cool courtyard under stars that feel close enough to touch. It smells of cedar wood, wine, and something faintly sweet, like crushed dates or warm honey. The mood has shifted. Everything is slower here, more deliberate, more lyrical. This isn't a temple or a courtroom, it's a bedroom, and someone, somewhere, is writing poetry. Not for a god, not for the state, but for someone they want to kiss. Tonight, you're in ancient Sumer, and for once, sex is being sung about. You find the tablets in a dusty corner of a scribe's workshop, half buried in broken pottery and forgotten shopping lists. But the script is unmistakable, elegant, curved, etched with care. It's a love poem, a real one, not a record, not a rite. A man writes to a woman, "My beloved, my caress is more savoury than honey. Your delights are sweet, your voice makes me glad." You read it again and again, because for the first time on this long journey, someone isn't writing about sex because they have to. They're writing because they want to. These are the love songs from Ur, the earliest surviving love poetry in human history. Composed over 4,000 years ago, they're dedicated to Inanna and Dumuzi, a goddess and her mortal, or maybe divine, lover. In the myth, Inanna chooses Dumuzi to be her consort in a symbolic marriage that ensures fertility for the land and the people. But the language, it's intimate, it's tender, it's sensual. Inanna speaks to him not like a goddess to a servant, but like a woman whispering in the dark. "Plough my vulva, man of my heart." And no, she's not being subtle. Your historical fact: the Sumerian sacred marriage was a ritual performed annually in ancient Mesopotamian cities, meant to reenact the union between Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility, and Dumuzi, her shepherd lover. A high priestess and king would take on the roles, performing symbolic and possibly literal sexual rites to ensure the fertility of the crops, animals, and people. The poetry written around these events is some of the oldest erotic literature we have, but here's the strange and wonderful part. While these rituals were part of official religious practice, the poems surrounding them seem personal. The lines don't read like political propaganda, they read like foreplay, which brings us to the quirky fringe theory. Some scholars believe these sacred poems may have originally come from real lovers, real people, whose words were later elevated into myth. That perhaps before they were mythologized, Inanna and Dumuzi were just two kids in love, and their words, raw and awkward and beautiful, were passed around until someone decided, yes, this is how gods must speak. Still, there's a long-standing academic fight about it. Were these poems genuine expressions of personal emotion, or carefully crafted temple scripts, recited like liturgy? Some argue that the very idea of romantic love as we understand it didn't exist yet, that these words were performance, not feeling. Others point to the intimacy of the language, the physicality, the size and metaphors, and insist that love, even pleasure, must have been real. You sit with the tension. Maybe it was both. Maybe the divine and the human weren't so separate here. Maybe they didn't need to be. You move through a festival crowd, music echoing through the square. Drums pulse like a heartbeat. Dancers in colourful sashes twirl, their bare feet raising dust. A woman sings to the rhythm, her voice deep and slow. You don't understand the words, but the tone is unmistakable. Longing. The crowd listens, quiet and reverent. No one's embarrassed. No one laughs. Here, desire is part of the human condition. Not shameful, not hidden, just acknowledged, sung about, lit into the sky. Later, in a shaded alcove, you see two lovers sharing a meal. Just fruit, some bread, and a jug of date wine. They're laughing. They lean in close. He touches her cheek and she lets him. There's no ritual here, no law, no priest peering through a curtain. It's not even nighttime yet. This is casual, familiar, almost modern. They might be married, they might be sneaking around, but whatever it is, it's theirs. You realise you haven't seen many moments like this. Not yet. Not until now. And it's not just women being sung about. Men too are described with care. The poems don't reduce them to warriors or rulers. Dumuzi is beloved. He's praised for his thighs, his scent, his voice. Inanna calls him sweet, not strong. You see a tenderness toward male beauty that feels out of place in the timeline you've been tracing so far. It's not power that makes someone desirable here. It's vulnerability. That's new. Still, sex in this world is not free from hierarchy. Inanna is powerful. Dumuzi's fate, in myth, is to die for her, and his descent into the underworld becomes a cautionary tale. Their love is fertile but doomed. Passion is divine, but also dangerous. And for all the singing and sighing, you know that these feelings, this joy, are always under threat by drought, by war, by decree. You wonder if that's why the poetry is so sweet. Because everyone knows how short the moment is. You look up at the night sky, stars scattered across the horizon like spilled barley. Somewhere, a priestess is singing Inanna's words to a king who pretends to be Dumuzi. Maybe they feel something, maybe they don't. But outside the temple walls, someone else is whispering the same words to someone they actually care about. Maybe those are the versions that survive, not in clay, but in memory. Here, in the soft hush of Sumerian dusk, you begin to feel it. The earliest true glimmer of pleasure. Not the act, but the anticipation. The way someone's voice can make your stomach twist. The way a touch on the shoulder lingers. The way words, poetry, not policy, can make desire feel almost holy. It's still rare, still dangerous, but it's here. And now that it's spoken aloud, it can't be undone. The marble under your feet is cool, and the air tastes like thyme and wine and the salty edge of philosophy. You're in ancient Greece now, sun-drenched, olive-heavy and dripping in contradictions. This is the land that gave the world democracy, drama, geometry, and somehow the idea that desire could be both noble and totally shameful, depending on who's doing the desiring. You're not in a bedroom or a temple this time. You're in a gymnasium, naked, naturally, surrounded by men debating ethics, lifting stones and casually flirting with boys. You squint up at white columns and find yourself in a society where sex is discussed with terrifying fluency. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has a preference. But pleasure? It's complicated. The Greeks don't see sex as inherently bad, but they're not chasing orgasms either. They're chasing virtue. And if pleasure happens along the way, great, but only if it doesn't make you weak. You sit in on a lesson where a wrinkled philosopher with a shiny forehead explains how desire is a test of the soul. Not a sin, not a right. A test. Good luck with that. The Greeks are obsessed with balance between passion and reason, body and mind, pleasure and discipline. They write about sex constantly, but rarely in the way you'd expect. In poetry, yes. In plays, absolutely. But in the street, you hear about it with the same tone you'd use to discuss weather or taxes. Matter of fact. A shrug. It's not hidden, but it's not celebrated either. Not in the sense of giddy indulgence. You're more likely to hear someone ask why you're drawn to someone than how it felt. Here's your historical fact. In classical Athens, the relationships that raised the least eyebrows weren't heterosexual marriages. They were pederastic mentorships between older men and adolescent boys. These were seen as educational and formative, as long as the older partner didn't get too emotionally attached and the younger partner didn't seem too eager. Married couples, meanwhile, were often encouraged to keep their passions in check. You were supposed to love your wife in a respectful, civic-minded way. Romance was for poetry, not the dining room. Now for the fringe fact that's just weird enough to be true. Some ancient Greek doctors believed that female pleasure was a medical necessity. If a woman was too hysterical, it meant her womb was wandering around her body in protest. Yes, wandering like a lost pet. And the cure? Orgasm, obviously. Midwives and physicians sometimes prescribed stimulation as a therapeutic remedy. Just another day at the ancient clinic. No big deal. Of course, this is also where the debate starts to boil. Did the Greeks enjoy sex in any way we'd recognise? Or was it all tangled up in their obsession with virtue, hierarchy and roles? Some scholars argue that Greek society was openly erotic. Look at the statues, the pottery, the dirty jokes in Lysistrata. Others insist that the Greeks were deeply anxious about pleasure and constantly inventing ways to sublimate it into more useful energies like war, poetry or philosophy. You walk through a symposium, where men recline on couches, sip wine, and talk about beauty like it's a riddle only the brave can solve. There's a lot of banter, a lot of double meanings. A poet toasts his friend and says something about thighs. Everyone laughs. No one blushes. This is normal. Desired bodies, especially youthful ones, are praised aloud, sculpted, immortalized in marble, but that praise rarely centers women. Female pleasure is mostly invisible, tucked behind curtains. The hetaira, the high-class courtesan, has more freedom, but she's still on a stage. Her appeal is her intelligence and wit as much as her body. She's clever, controlled, but never truly free. You visit a bathhouse, and everything is slippery and loud. Men joke, splash, wrestle. You think you see a flirtation unfold in the corner, but it's hard to tell. Greeks touch each other constantly, and the line between affection and seduction is bendy. Later, in a private room above a tavern, a courtesan leans over her client. Not seductive, but sharp. She asks if he's worth her time. He stammers. She smirks. You realise she's playing a part. She has to. Pleasure isn't part of her wage. If she feels it, it's accidental. And yet, you can't deny the raw honesty in some of their writings. The poet Sappho, yes, that's Sappho, the one they tried to erase with centuries of awkward footnotes, writes about love and longing with startling intimacy. She writes to women, about women, with a clarity that cuts through all the posturing. You burn me, she says, with desire. No metaphors, no apologies, just fire. You sit with one of her fragments in your lap, and for a moment it's the most human thing you've heard in centuries. Still, for most people in ancient Greece, sex remains stratified. Men dominate, women obey. Boys are mentored, girls are married off. Passion, when it shows up, is dangerous. Too much, and you're seen as undisciplined. Too little, and you're seen as cold. Everyone's pretending to walk the line. No one really does. Pleasure, when it happens, must always be justifiable, in service of beauty, health, procreation, or power. You attend a religious festival in honour of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and unhinged desire. For one night, all the rules dissolve, masks go on, clothes fall off, people dance until they collapse, and in this blur of music and movement you catch glimpses of what might be real pleasure, uncontrolled, unregulated, almost feral. But by morning, the masks are back on, the wine is watered down, and everyone pretends they don't remember. Back at the agora, philosophers debate whether desire makes a man weak or wise. Some say it distracts from reason, others claim it reveals truth. You listen for hours. They quote Plato and Heraclitus. No one mentions women. You wonder if anyone's actually had good sex lately, or if they're just too busy thinking about it. You walk away from Athens feeling conflicted. Sex here is not sacred, not shameful, but something stranger. It's a symbol, a performance, a test. The Greeks thought about it constantly, but rarely surrendered to it without guilt or theory. And pleasure? Still not the point. Still suspicious. Still something you have to explain afterward. If it happens, it better lead to wisdom, or at least a good speech. But the poems remain quiet, smouldering, honest. They remind you that underneath all the marble and logic, someone was watching someone else laugh in a sunbeam and thinking, I want. That's enough, for now. The marble melts beneath your feet, and now you're standing on warm stone streets slick with the scent of olive oil, sweat, and ambition. Welcome to Rome, louder, meaner, and far more theatrical than the measured musings of Greece. If Athens was a debate, Rome is a feast, and sex here, it's on the table in the alley behind the bathhouse curtain, and if you've got enough power, anywhere else you please. You've just entered the heart of an empire that glorifies conquest in every form, including the most intimate ones. Here, desire doesn't whisper behind veils. It roars over goblets of wine. You walk past a rowdy dinner party where men recline elbow to elbow on couches, wiping their mouths and making jokes that would make a modern HR department combust. Everything is performative, boastful, and as for pleasure, it exists, but not in a democratic way. In Rome, who gets to enjoy sex and how is dictated not by love or chemistry, but by rank. You see it in the street art, carved into walls and painted across the villas of Pompeii. Naked bodies, exaggerated features, scenes you wouldn't expect on the walls of your cousin's Airbnb. These aren't acts of spiritual devotion, they're status symbols. Look at what I can do. Look at what I can afford. Look at who must obey me. It's brash, unapologetic, and dripping with power dynamics. The act itself? Sure, it might feel good. But that's not why it's happening. Your historical fact. In ancient Rome, sex was governed by a strict social code. It wasn't about who you slept with. It was about what role you played. A freeborn Roman male citizen could take the penetrative role in almost any encounter, man, woman, slave, or sex worker, and maintain his honour. But to be on the receiving end? That to Romans was degrading. Unless you were lower in status, in which case your consent didn't even factor in. That leads you to a fact that's both fringe and infuriating. Elite Roman men would sometimes host elaborate parties where guests were invited to watch sexual acts performed live, often involving enslaved people. These weren't orgies in the sexy, grape-fed fantasy sense. They were power displays. The pleasure was real, maybe, but not mutual. In Rome, pleasure without dominance wasn't worth the effort. You walk into a balnea, one of the city's many public baths. It's a swirl of steam and laughter, where people of every class gather to bathe, gossip, and sometimes flirt. Sex isn't exactly encouraged here, but it's not discreetly tucked away either. There are attendants, prostitutes, and plenty of side glances. The rules vary depending on who's watching and who's involved. In some parts of town, the baths are a place of leisure. In others, they're marketplaces for bodies, rented by the hour. You keep your towel on and try not to make eye contact. Later, in the forum, you see a woman dressed in expensive fabrics, her hair stacked high in complicated braids. She's a meretrix, a legal courtesan, and she moves with practiced grace through a crowd of men pretending not to watch her. She has clients, she has power, but even she is tethered to the expectations of the patriarchy. If she enjoys her work, it must be a performance. If she feels anything real, it's a risk. Her pleasure, like everything else in Rome, must be calculated. You wander through a villa on the outskirts of the city and find a garden fresco that surprises you. Amid the usual scenes of fruit and feasting, there's a tender depiction. Two women lounging together, arms around each other smiling. There's no explicit content, no power imbalance, just softness. A moment of intimacy painted into stone. You wonder who lived here, who commissioned it, whether it was a declaration or a secret. Maybe, just maybe, someone here believed sex didn't always have to be about control, but those glimpses are rare. Most Roman love poetry is an exercise in possession. Catullus writes to Lesbia, obsessive, bitter, obsessive again. Ovid crafts elaborate guides on how to seduce women and how to get away with cheating. His Ars Amatoria is clever, sure, but soaked in entitlement. Desire is always about the speaker. The subject, the beloved, is passive. There's little concern for what she wants, if she wants anything. The poetry doesn't ask. And yet, Rome is also the birthplace of satire. People here know they're absurd. They know their public displays of masculinity are ridiculous, their rigid gender roles performative. You hear the echo of that in the biting comedy of Plautus, in the sarcastic inscriptions scrawled on latrine walls. I screwed the barmaid. She said thanks. I said you're welcome. Crude, yes, but oddly self-aware. In Rome, even sex jokes have a punchline that turns inward. The scholarly debate here gets thorny. Did the Romans care about female pleasure at all? Some texts suggest they did, even prized it, in the bedroom at least, if not in public. Others argue that pleasure was never the point, especially not for women or enslaved people. Some scholars point to erotic manuals and sexual sculptures as proof of a broader tolerance. Others call it wishful thinking. The truth, as usual, is a tangle of both. You end the day in the shadow of the Colosseum, where blood once soaked the sand and the roar of the crowd was as much about dominance as it was entertainment. You think about how often Rome blurred those two things, sex and violence, pleasure and pain, love and ownership. Here, sex was loud, it was legal, but it was rarely equal. Still, even in this empire of marble and might, someone, somewhere, wrote, "I would rather kiss your mouth than drink a goblet of wine." That line didn't survive because it was official. It survived because someone meant it. And in that meaning, clumsy, honest and rare, you find again the thread of pleasure. Not power, not conquest, just desire, unwrapped for once. It's not enough to shift the culture, but it's enough to remind you, Pleasure always finds a crack in the wall. You wake to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, reverent quiet of a world watching itself. Rome is behind you now, crumbled and cracked, and you've landed somewhere far more restrained, darker, colder, quieter. You're walking through a landscape where stone replaces flesh, where desire is something to fear, not follow. A new god rules here, and unlike the chaotic pantheons of the past, this one has only one voice, one law, one story, and in it, sex is no longer a civic duty or a sacred performance. It is temptation. Welcome to the rise of monotheism. You're in the early centuries of Christianity, just after the fall of Rome, when a once marginal faith has begun its slow transformation into empire. And like all empires, it has a complicated relationship with bodies. You sit in a candlelit chamber beneath a basilica, listening to a bishop preach about purity. His voice is calm, unwavering. He speaks of heaven, of sacrifice, of resisting the animal self. And that self, it wants, it hungers, it must be disciplined. The message is clear, the body is weak, and sex is its greatest vulnerability. Not because it's ineffective or messy, but because it feels good, and anything that feels good without divine approval is dangerous. You look around the room and see men and women nodding solemnly. Some wear rings of chastity, some whisper prayers under their breath. Everyone here is trying not to want. Your historical fact. In early Christian thought, particularly that shaped by theologians like Augustine, sex was considered inseparable from original sin. Augustine argued that the desire for pleasure, even within marriage, was a consequence of humanity's fall from grace. Sex could be tolerated, yes, but only if its purpose was reproduction. Any enjoyment? That was a moral failing, a sign that you hadn't wrestled your flesh into submission. Here's your unsettling fringe detail. There were early Christian sects, like the Gnostics, who took this further and saw all physical existence as a kind of cosmic mistake. They believed true holiness came from renouncing the body entirely. Some went so far as to encourage celibacy to the point of self-mutilation. If you're feeling a bit tense right now, that's probably appropriate. And here's where the scholarly debate gets spicy. Was this obsession with sexual restraint a genuine spiritual philosophy, or a tool of control? Some historians argue that the early church saw sexuality, especially female sexuality, as a threat to social order. By placing strict limits on sexual behaviour, the church gained enormous influence over marriage, family, and even daily thought. Others believe it was a sincere attempt to transcend the material world. Either way, the result was the same. Sex became shame. You walk through a monastery, the air thick with incense and discipline. Monks tend gardens in silence, their eyes downcast, their belts tight. In their cells, they write long treatises about temptation, chronicling their own failures in obsessive detail. One man claims that demons visited him in the form of naked women each night. He writes that he beat himself with nettles to rid the images from his mind. This isn't exaggeration, this is his reality. Pleasure is the enemy, the battlefield is his own body. Outside the walls, things aren't much better. You visit a village where marriage is arranged by land and livestock. The bride is veiled, silent. The groom is slightly drunk. No one asks what they feel. There's no ritual of connection, just obligation, followed by a hasty consummation, while relatives drink mead in the next room. A priest blesses the union, but warns against excess. Do what must be done, he says, and no more. But not everyone follows the rules. Behind closed doors, people still whisper, still touch, still crave. You hear stories of secret lovers meeting in forests, of married women sneaking into the arms of men who treat them like people instead of property. These acts are considered mortal sins, and yet they happen anyway. The very fact that pleasure is forbidden only sharpens its edge. You visit a scriptorium and find a monk copying a manuscript by hand. It's a medical text, older than the church itself, with notes on female anatomy and aphrodisiacs. He pauses at a section describing how certain herbs may heat the blood. He crosses out the line and writes periculosum in the margin. Dangerous. It's not just that sex is wrong, it's that knowing about sex is wrong. Ignorance is safer, holy. Still, some things can't be erased. You stumble on an apocryphal text, something not sanctioned by the church. In it, Mary Magdalene isn't a whore, but a disciple. And her relationship with Jesus? Tender, close, maybe even romantic. It's blasphemous by the standards of the time, but it rings with a different kind of truth. A truth the official stories can't quite smother. And even within the church itself, contradictions bloom. There are hymns written by nuns that speak of God like a lover, visions where Christ appears not as a judge, but as a bridegroom. Ecstasy sneaks in through spiritual loopholes. If physical pleasure is outlawed, then mystical pleasure becomes the only safe outlet. And suddenly, divine union sounds suspiciously like the real thing. You read one account from a 12th century mystic who writes, "He touched me and I melted." She's not talking about heaven. Not entirely. You leave the monastery and walk through a bustling town square. A beggar whistles at a pretty woman. She ignores him, but smiles once she's passed. A baker's apprentice leans too close to the farmer's daughter. They laugh, then vanish into the alley. Life, it seems, has not read the rulebook. Pleasure keeps happening, quietly, defiantly, under cloaks, behind hedges, in whispered prayers no one hears. You sit beneath a chapel window, stained glass casting rainbows on your hands. Inside, a priest is giving confession. Outside, a young couple is holding hands under their cloaks. They're nervous, breathless, giddy. They don't know if what they're doing is love or lust or just the first chance they've had to feel wanted by someone who isn't God. But whatever it is, it's real, and it feels good. And that's more dangerous than any demon. In this world, pleasure has become the underground river running beneath everything. Not gone, not destroyed, just driven deeper. It hides in songs, in stories, in secret places, but it hasn't disappeared. It's just waiting for a less judgmental century. You're still in the shadow of cathedrals, but something has shifted. There's a new kind of hush in the air, not the heavy silence of monasteries, but the charged stillness of a room where someone's trying very hard not to think about sex. You've arrived in the early Christian Middle Ages, where the greatest act of rebellion is not seduction, but abstinence. Welcome to a world where celibacy isn't just a virtue, it's a spiritual weapon, a golden badge of holiness, and for some, a direct hotline to the divine. You're sitting in a bare stone cell with a young man named Marcus. He's pale, underfed, and trembling with intensity. He's just taken a vow of chastity, and not the kind that leaves wiggle room. This is full, hard-edged, bodily renunciation. He's removed himself from the world. No women, no marriage, no touching, not even glances. Sex, to him, is the greatest danger he'll ever face, more threatening than hunger, plague, or sword. He clasps his hands tightly, muttering the Lord's Prayer to keep the image of a barmaid's ankle from overpowering his soul. And the thing is, it's working. Not perfectly, but enough. He believes that by denying himself he's gaining something greater. Eternity, favour, a kind of moral superiority that sets him apart. In a society where earthly pleasure is fleeting and dangerous, Marcus has chosen immortality over indulgence, and weirdly, in doing so, he becomes desirable. Because here's the twist. Nothing makes someone hotter in the Middle Ages than absolute sexual inaccessibility. Your historical fact. By the early medieval period, virginity, especially for women, had become synonymous with holiness. Saints' lives are packed with young girls who turn away suitors, endure torture, and even die before sacrificing their chastity. In some hagiographies, a woman is admired more for dying without sex than for anything she actually did while alive. Virginity wasn't just a private choice, it was public currency, and for men, celibacy became the gold standard for clergy. The idea was that priests, monks, and hermits could channel their energy toward God by refusing all earthly ties, including marriage. The logic? You can't serve two masters, and if you're not burning with desire, then you've proven yourself worthy of higher spiritual tasks. That's right. The absence of sex became a job qualification. Now, for a fringe fact that feels like a Monty Python sketch, some saints were so committed to celibacy, they went to bizarre lengths to avoid temptation. There's a story of one monk who threw himself into a thorn bush every time he felt aroused. Another tied a stone to his genitals and prayed it would weigh down his sins. These weren't symbolic acts. These were very real, very desperate attempts to beat biology into submission. Spoiler, it rarely worked. There's still an academic tug-of-war about whether this wave of celibacy was about faith or fear. Some scholars argue it was a sincere spiritual movement. People really did believe sex was a distraction from the soul's journey. Others argue it was about control, of women, of inheritance, of priestly power. If clergy didn't marry, they couldn't pass wealth to children. That meant more land and influence stayed in church hands. Holy poverty, it turns out, could be a great business model. You wander into a nunnery where the atmosphere is both serene and suffocating. The sisters move in silence, except during hymns. Their eyes are trained downward, their fingers always busy. But even here, you sense that desire hasn't left. It's just been rebranded. Sister Agnes writes prayers that sound suspiciously like love poems. "My soul longs for you," she scrawls in the margins of her psalter. "Your kiss sweeter than wine, your embrace like fire in my bones." She's talking about Jesus, sure, but the language? It aches, and she's not alone. Across the continent, mystics, especially women, begin experiencing spiritual ecstasies that blur the line between divine rapture and physical release. St. Teresa of Avila famously describes an angel piercing her with a golden spear, leaving her aflame with the love of God and moaning with sweetness. The Church tolerates these visions because they come with suffering, and because the women who have them often remain obedient. But anyone paying attention can see the overlap. When sex is denied long enough, it doesn't disappear, it transforms. Back outside the cloisters, everyday people still marry, still have sex, still break the rules. But now there's a deep undercurrent of guilt running through everything. A young couple sneaks off to the barn during harvest season, their laughter hushed. Afterward, they each go to confession, whispering their sins behind a wooden screen. A priest listens, nods, assigns penance, sometimes a prayer, sometimes a fast. It's a ritual in itself now: sin, confess, repeat. Even within marriage, sex is a tightly regulated act. Church teachings say it's only acceptable within the bounds of matrimony, and even then, only if it's for procreation. If you're enjoying it too much, better repent. If a woman initiates, she's suspect. If a man enjoys it too often, he's weak. Marital intimacy becomes a minefield, where too much pleasure is as dangerous as too little. And don't even think about same-sex desire. That isn't just sinful, it's heresy, punishable by death in some corners of the continent. Yet still, the body resists. You visit a travelling fair where bawdy songs float through the air. A juggler tosses apples while reciting verses about the miller's wife and her secret lover. Children laugh, adults blush, no one reports him. In these fleeting moments of festivity, the rules relax, not disappear, just loosen their grip. A merchant buys a charm promising to make his wife more affectionate. A widow giggles at a wandering bard's flirtation. Desire keeps leaking through the cracks, refusing to die. And even the saints, in their most sacred moments, sometimes slip. You read one account of a monk who, after 30 years of celibacy, dreams vividly of a woman he once saw in the marketplace. He wakes shaking, ashamed, weeping. But the account ends with a curious line: "Even in his failure he became holy." As if the struggle itself, not the victory, was what counted. That's the paradox of this era. Sex is everywhere and nowhere. A sin and a secret. A temptation and a test. The people here are trying, truly trying, to live up to impossible ideals. But pleasure, like water, finds its way. Through dreams, through visions, through quiet touches in the dark. No one's calling it pleasure yet. But it's happening all the same. You end your night in a dark chapel, the scent of beeswax and damp stone in your nose. A choir sings a hymn about purity, their voices haunting and pure. But outside, just beyond the candlelight, you hear the quiet creak of footsteps. Two lovers slipping away from the crowd, breathing each other's names like prayers. You wake to the sound of hooves on cobblestone, distant church bells ringing, and the unmistakable rattle of a world strung tight between heaven and hell. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the landscape is all pointed towers, superstition and repressed hunger. The plague comes and goes like an impatient landlord, kings war over scraps of land, and the church is stronger than ever, every whisper of desire now filtered through fire and judgment. In this world, your body is not yours, it belongs to God, and if you forget that, even for a second, someone might burn you for it. You're walking through a muddy village tucked beneath a looming cathedral, and everything about it seems designed to crush impulse. The buildings lean inward like they're eavesdropping on you. Eyes peer from behind shutters. Gossip moves faster than disease. At the heart of it all, the church reminds everyone that sex is, at best, a dangerous necessity. At worst, a gateway to damnation. You're told that even married couples should avoid it during Lent, Advent, Fridays, feast days, and any time that feels too joyful, which by the math leaves about 4 days a year when it's technically safe to have morally sanctioned sex, and even then, no funny business. You listen to a priest deliver a sermon in a rain-soaked chapel. He speaks in Latin, but the meaning is clear. Lust is the devil's favourite doorway. The fall began with desire. Eve wanted more. Adam followed her, and now you can't even admire someone's hair without imagining hellfire. The congregation listens, heads bowed. Some truly believe it. Others sneak glances across the pews, wondering what it might feel like to reach out and touch someone just once. Here's your historical fact. The medieval church classified sex outside of marriage as a mortal sin, punishable by public penance, flogging, or excommunication. Even within marriage, sex had to follow strict guidelines. No unnatural positions, no contraception, and absolutely no enjoyment for its own sake. And yes, there were literal confession manuals that outlined acceptable and unacceptable behaviours in painstaking detail. If you've ever had a priest with a checklist of sins, thank the Middle Ages. Now for the weird fringe bit that feels made up but isn't. In certain places, theologians believe that too much sexual pleasure, especially for women, could summon demons. Yes, demons. There were documented cases where women were accused of having intercourse with incubi, male demons said to prey on their dreams. The church sometimes claimed these encounters were invited through excessive desire, which meant that just wanting too much could be considered an act of sorcery. And this is where things get truly dark, because in this time, desire doesn't just make you sinful, it can make you suspicious, dangerous. If you're a woman who knows how herbs work, who owns a mirror, or who enjoys her body, you might be called a witch, not metaphorically, literally. You watch as a healer is dragged from her hut because she helped a neighbour with a fertility tincture. The local priest has decided it's unnatural. Her hair is unbound, her laugh is remembered. That's enough. By nightfall, she's confessed to everything they wanted her to. The great scholarly debate of this era, whether the church's teachings about sex actually shaped public behaviour, or whether people mostly nodded along and did what they wanted behind closed doors. There's strong evidence for both. Court records show cases of fornication, adultery and lewdness punished harshly. But they also show repeated offences, which suggests that people weren't exactly repenting with conviction. Some historians argue that official sexual repression existed side by side with a thriving underground of lusty behaviour. Like two versions of the same world running in parallel, one lit by candlelight, the other by torch. And speaking of underground, you stumble into a manuscript buried deep in a monastery archive. It's hand-illustrated, gilded, and filled with religious commentary, but in the margins, a different story plays out. Tiny figures chase each other, kiss, fondle, dance. It's playful, graphic, absurd. A monk has doodled these erotic scenes between pages of theology. You realise that even the most devout couldn't resist the pull. Sex had become something to laugh at, to hide, to sneak in where no one was supposed to look. But it hadn't disappeared. It just moved to the edges. At a nearby court, a noblewoman and her ladies read from a book of courtly love poetry. The words are delicate, indirect, but unmistakably passionate. A knight pledges his life to a lady whose touch he cannot have. Their love is doomed, restrained, eternal. Everyone in the room sighs at the tragedy of it all. But you notice the glint in the lady's eye. Maybe she likes the game. Maybe the denial is part of the pleasure. Or maybe, just maybe, she slips out later to meet someone who isn't reciting rhymes but is more than willing to say exactly what he wants. And down in the tavern, bawdy songs fill the air. A bard sings about the blacksmith's daughter, who's lost her chastity under the apple cart. Everyone laughs. A young man gets slapped. A woman slaps him harder, then buys him a drink. There's a current here, raucous, crude, alive. This is the part of the Middle Ages the churchmen try to suppress. The part that drinks too much, touches too much, and doesn't care what the sermons say. It's not romantic, but it is real. You sit by a fire at the edge of the village watching a couple hold each other under a shared cloak. They're not married, they're not blessed, but they've risked something just to feel close. You wonder how many others have done the same. How many quiet rebellions have burned under wool blankets and moonless skies? There is no word for pleasure here that doesn't come with guilt attached, but the feeling is there anyway, like hunger, like breath, always returning. This world tries to make sex something shameful, secret, or sacred, but never something joyful, and still, the people keep finding ways to claim it. Through songs, through stories, through gestures too small to punish. The body remembers what the church tries to erase. And beneath it all, deep and unspoken, the question remains, what if it's not wrong to want? What if it just is? You wake in silk. That's the first clue this place is different. You're not in a drafty chapel or a muddy village this time. You're in a palace. All polished stone floors, velvet cushions, and perfume that lingers in the air like a flirtatious rumour. You've landed squarely in the high Middle Ages, where everything is more extravagant, more performative, and, strangely, more romantic. Welcome to the court, where desire has been leashed, perfumed, and taught to dance. This is the age of courtly love, where sex is absolutely everywhere, as long as no one's actually doing it. You drift through a great hall filled with nobles and poets, minstrels and ladies with hair long enough to trip over. They're playing at love like it's a sport, with rules, with costumes, with winners and losers. A knight kneels before a lady, pledging undying devotion. She offers him her sleeve as a token, her smile as a challenge. They will write letters, they will exchange glances, they will pine for each other with soul-wrenching intensity. But will they ever touch? Ah, that's the twist. Because in this world, love is purest when unconsummated. The more impossible the desire, the more noble the passion. Wanting is refined, having is vulgar. Lust is for peasants and sinners. Longing, that's where the artistry lies. These people have turned frustration into a full-time job. Your historical fact, the concept of fin amour, or refined love, emerged in the 12th century France and spread across European courts like a fever dream. It was heavily influenced by troubadour poetry and the chivalric code. Knights were expected to fall in love with unattainable noblewomen, usually married, whom they would serve with total devotion, often through poetry, song, and acts of valour. It was emotional theatre with tight sexual boundaries. Now for the quirky fringe twist. Some scholars believe that courtly love was essentially an elite social game. Flirtation, a status symbol. Love letters and poems became a kind of aristocratic currency. You weren't taken seriously unless someone was pining for you in iambic pentameter. A noblewoman without at least one agonised poet crawling at her feet might as well have been invisible. Desire became performance art. The more you suffered, the more sophisticated you were. But here's the ongoing scholarly tug-of-war. Was any of this real? Did these knights and ladies actually fall for each other, or was it all a literary construct? Some argue that courtly love was just a clever way for people to vent sexual frustration within a rigid social system. Safe fantasies painted with polite metaphors. Others insist it provided a rare space for emotional intimacy, especially for women who are otherwise locked into political marriages. The truth? Likely both. Because while the poetry soared, the body remained stuck. You're at a tournament now, where knights clash in armour for the amusement of the court. Between matches, they recite verses under the fluttering gaze of noble women. One knight, a lanky sunburnt guy with a chipped tooth, quotes lines from The Romance of the Rose and gazes up at a duchess like she's a star he might lasso. She laughs behind her fan. He won't ever touch her, and they both know it. But the performance is what matters. Everyone here is playing a part. In the gardens beyond the palace, lovers meet under cover of darkness. Some recite poetry. Others skip the lines and go straight to the scandal. For all the talk of restraint, there are plenty of pregnancies that get resolved by a hasty trip to a convent or an arranged marriage to a conveniently available cousin. You see a kitchen maid slip away with a squire. No poetry, no veil, just fingers hooked into fabric and the quiet rustle of need. It's messy, it's real, it's everything the poems pretend not to be. You find a lady alone in her solar, reading a book with flushed cheeks. It's not a Bible, it's Tristan and Isolde, the tale of doomed lovers who drink a potion and can't resist each other, even when they try. It's tragic, of course. They die. Everyone dies. But the story pulses with yearning, with the thrill of forbidden touch. The lady reads the same paragraph twice, then stares out the window, her fingers absently stroking the embroidery in her lap. She knows that love like that isn't safe. but she wants it anyway. The tension in this world is exquisite. Pleasure is everywhere, hinted at in glances, draped in silk, whispered in songs, but always just out of reach. Women are praised as muses but denied as partners. Men are encouraged to worship but never to claim. And when someone crosses the line, the whole system shudders. A noble woman caught in an affair can be banished, ruined, or worse. A knight might lose his title. The court thrives on desire, but only the impossible kind. You overhear two minstrels arguing in a courtyard. One insists that true love can only exist when it's never acted upon. The other snorts and says he'd rather have 5 minutes with a kitchen maid than a lifetime of sighing at a duchess. They both have a point. One writes songs, the other writes limericks. Both are, in their way, expressing the same ache. And yet in private things are shifting. You find a letter tucked in a book of psalms written by a noblewoman to her knight. The words are trembling, desperate. She begs him not to leave for the crusade. She tells him what she dreams of at night. She says she wants more than poems. She wants him. This is not for the court. This is not for performance. This is real. The rules of courtly love say that she should accept his departure with grace, maybe write a tear-stained sonnet. But she's done waiting. She doesn't want to be a symbol. She wants to be touched. In that letter, you find something dangerously close to modern desire. The belief that pleasure isn't just a reward or a sin. It's something you might actually deserve. You sit by a fountain as the sun sets over the spires of the castle. A couple passes by, their hands not quite touching. Their eyes meet for just a second longer than is polite. Somewhere in the distance a lute begins to play, and a voice rises in song about unrequited love. But here, at this moment, you realise something has changed. Even if sex is still cloaked in metaphor, the language is evolving. Love no longer belongs just to gods or kings. It belongs to poets, to dreamers, to anyone bold enough to long for it. And pleasure? It's no longer just a shadow at the edge of the story. It's the reason the story exists. You wake to incense and jasmine, the air thick with something both sacred and sensual. A lattice window filters soft light into a chamber, adorned with silk cushions, carved sandalwood panels, and the low hum of distant music. You've stepped far from the stony halls of medieval Europe into a world entirely different, warm, fluid, deliberate. You're in ancient India now, and sex here isn't just tolerated or performed, it's studied, taught, even celebrated. For the first time in this journey, you've landed in a place where pleasure isn't accidental or forbidden. It's an art. You wander through an elegant courtyard filled with the scent of sandalwood and rosewater. Peacocks strut along the garden path, while scholars debate beneath flowering trees. They're not arguing whether desire is sinful. They're discussing its rhythms, its ethics, its aesthetics. In this world, sexuality is not a separate category of life. It's woven into daily practice, philosophy, and even architecture. You see it carved into temple walls, figures locked in intricate embraces, limbs flowing like dance. No shame, no censorship, just the human body rendered divine. Your historical fact, the Kama Sutra, written in the 3rd century CE by the scholar Vatsyayana, is not a sex manual in the modern sense, despite what your coffee table edition might suggest. It's a comprehensive guide to living a balanced, meaningful life. One of the 4 main goals of human existence in Hindu philosophy. Dharma, duty. Artha, prosperity. Karma, desire. And moksha, liberation. Karma desire isn't shameful. It's one of the pillars of a life well lived. And yes, the text contains detailed descriptions of physical intimacy, but it also includes chapters on choosing a partner, building emotional compatibility, and creating aesthetic environments for love to flourish. There are sections on perfumes, conversation, music, even furniture, because here sex is not just a thing you do, it's a discipline, a collaboration, a craft. Now for the strange but delightful fringe detail, some medieval Indian texts on Karma lists 64 arts every cultured person should master, not just sexual positions, but also singing, painting, perfumery, storytelling and puzzle solving. A well-rounded lover, it turns out, could recite poetry, arrange flowers, and also tie you into a pretzel without chipping their bangles. The point? Pleasure here is holistic. It's not just about stimulation, it's about context. Of course, this doesn't mean ancient India was some utopia of equality. The reality was layered and often contradictory. Caste, class, and gender shaped everything. The Kama Sutra assumes male privilege, and many of its sections treat women as participants in a game whose rules they didn't write. Some scholars argue that women were often sexualized but rarely empowered. Others point to female poets and courtesans who exercised remarkable influence, especially within the realms of love, art, and religious devotion. You sit in the shaded balcony of a house in Varanasi and listen to a group of women recite verses from Gatha Saptashati, a collection of ancient love poems. These aren't about spiritual ecstasy or chaste longing. They're earthy, direct, sensual. One poem describes a girl sneaking away from her in-laws to meet her lover by the mango tree. Another boasts of a tryst so satisfying she doesn't care if the neighbours heard. These aren't fantasies. They're lived experiences turned into art. The pleasure here is unmistakably feminine and fully owned. Then there's the temple. You visit Khajuraho, where entire complexes are adorned with erotic carvings so explicit they'd make a Roman blush. But these images aren't tucked away. They're in plain view, part of sacred architecture. You see gods, mortals, even mythological beings engaged in acts of love. Some are playful, some are acrobatic, and some are downright confusing. You make a mental note to Google, "What is happening in panel 37?" The point is not to arouse, it's to reflect the fullness of life. Birth, desire, death, rebirth. In this cosmology, the body is not separate from the divine, it's an expression of it. You watch as a priest performs a daily puja, offering flowers and fire to a statue of Parvati, consort of Shiva. Their story is both romantic and erotic, a divine partnership filled with longing, union, separation, and reunion. Shiva, the great ascetic, is also the great lover. Parvati, the goddess of fertility and power, seduces him not with tricks but with devotion. Their lovemaking shakes the cosmos, literally. The myths don't hide this, they centre it. Celibacy and sensuality are not enemies here. They're two sides of the same spiritual coin. Yet even in this culture that celebrates pleasure, you find contradictions. In some texts, desire is praised. In others, warned against as a path to attachment and suffering. The epics, like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, are filled with stories where desire leads to betrayal, war, or exile. The gods themselves struggle with lust and consequence. Pleasure is powerful, which means it's also dangerous, not evil, but volatile. You walk past a school where young students chant verses, their voices clear and steady. One verse, from the Bhagavad Gita, warns against becoming a slave to the senses. Another speaks of finding peace through self-control. The message here is not that pleasure is wrong, but that it must be mastered. That indulgence, unchecked, leads to chaos. Even the Kama Sutra warns against obsession. Pleasure is part of life, but it's not all of life. As evening falls, you sit beneath a neem tree with an elderly couple who've been married for over 40 years. They laugh easily, finishing each other's sentences. When asked about pleasure, the husband smiles and says, "It changes. When we are young, it was fire. Now it is warmth." His wife chuckles and adds, "He still snores after." Their comfort with each other, their memory of passion, still alive, still sacred, is more powerful than any temple carving, and that's the difference here. Pleasure isn't only for the young, the beautiful, or the free, it's part of every stage of life, woven into ritual, poetry, partnership. It's not hidden, it's not whispered, it's spoken aloud with elegance and confidence. For the first time in your journey, you're in a place where pleasure is not the opposite of wisdom, it's a form of it. The sun sets, casting long golden light across the temple steps. A group gathers for music, and a woman sings a thumri, a romantic classical song about Radha and Krishna, divine lovers who meet in secret under moonlight. The lyrics are filled with yearning, joy, teasing, fulfillment. The audience sighs. A young couple leans into each other, unnoticed. Pleasure here doesn't have to hide. It can walk beside prayer, sit in poetry, be folded into love songs and temple walls. It's not perfect, but for once, it's allowed. And that, in this long journey of silent longing and sacred duty, feels like a revolution. You wake to the soft creak of paper sliding open, and the gentle rustle of silk brushing tatami mats. The world smells of cedar and plum blossoms. The light here is muted, intentional, as if even the sun knows not to barge in too loudly. You're in Heian-era Japan, 1,000 years ago, in a society so refined, so meticulously curated, that even desire wears robes of etiquette. This is not a place where sex shouts. Here, it whispers. It lingers behind paper screens and inside poems written on fans. You've stepped into a world where sensuality is not about bodies at all. It's about atmosphere. A woman glides past, her kimono trailing behind her like mist. Her hair reaches the floor, perfectly brushed, scented with camellia oil. She doesn't look at you. She doesn't need to. In this society, attention is a precious gift, rarely given outright. Everything is layered. A glance through a screen, the sleeve of a robe seen from behind a folding door, a letter scented with clove and folded just so. Intimacy here begins with detail. You follow her through the corridors of a noble estate where nothing is accidental. In Heian Japan, aesthetics are everything. Sound, scent, shadow, season. Love doesn't start with a kiss. It starts with a verse. And sex? That arrives much later, if it arrives at all, and only after the proper poetic rituals have been performed to a standard that would make a perfectionist weep. Your historical fact. In the Heian period, 794 to 1185, courtly life revolved around refined taste, especially in romantic affairs. Men and women often engaged in literary exchanges, waka poetry being the most popular medium of flirtation. A well-composed verse could unlock a door, both metaphorically and literally. Sexual relationships were shaped more by emotion, timing and elegance than raw physicality. Clumsiness was not just awkward, it was offensive. You peek into a bedroom, not a boudoir but a private space of layered bedding and shadows. A man kneels near a woman, not touching her, but reciting a poem about the colour of her sleeve and the way the moon reflected on her hair. She smiles, slowly. He stays through the night, as custom demands, but leaves before dawn. By morning, she'll decide whether to write back or vanish forever. That one night, it may be the only one they ever share, and it will still be a love story. Now for the fringe fact. Courtships often took place over months of secret letters, each one folded and perfumed uniquely. The scent itself was a kind of signature. One tale from the Tale of Genji, Japan's famous literary epic from this era, describes a noblewoman identifying her secret admirer by the scent left on his robes. She's not just attracted to him, she's attracted to his essence, his presentation, the way he understands the language of longing. And here's the debate that keeps historians scratching their heads. Was Heian-era romance deeply intimate, or entirely performative? Some argue that all the rules, rituals, and required poetry created emotional depth through anticipation and restraint. Others say the whole thing was theatre, high-stakes social climbing dressed up as tenderness. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere in the overlap. The people here felt something, and if it was sometimes more about the performance than the pleasure, does that make the feeling less real? You sit in a garden during a poetry gathering. Cherry blossoms fall like soft punctuation. A courtier reads a verse comparing a fleeting kiss to a snowflake melting on skin. The group murmurs in appreciation. You watch as a woman slips a folded paper into her sleeve, her face impassive, but her posture just a touch more open. This is foreplay in Heian Japan. Language, suggestion, timing. Sex might happen later, or not at all. And if it does, no one will describe it directly. They'll say he visited or she received him, and let implication do the rest. But outside the elite circles, things are different. Farmers and workers still live by necessity, not poetry. Their intimacy is more immediate, more practical. A smile across a field, a shared drink, a warm body in winter. You see a couple crouched together in a rice storehouse, laughing, whispering. There's no exchange of verses, no clove-scented parchment, just hands, breath, skin. Still tender, still real. Back at court, the rules tighten again. A woman receives a poem from a suitor whose handwriting is a touch too sloppy. She burns it without reading. A man's robe smells of old sandalwood instead of fresh plum. He is dismissed. In this world, even the idea of sex is subject to aesthetic scrutiny. It's not about what you do, it's about how you do it, and what kind of paper you wrap it in. And then, there's the tale of Genji itself, written by Murasaki Shikibu, a noblewoman and literary genius who somehow turned the quiet seductions of court life into a sprawling novel of love, loss, and fleeting beauty. Genji, her hero, is as seductive as he is selfish, moving through lovers with the grace of a poem and the emotional depth of a falling leaf. His affairs are poetic, yes, but they are also deeply human, full of longing, miscommunication, even regret. This is where you see it, the real human ache beneath the elegant mask. You visit a shrine at dusk where a woman prays beneath a cherry tree. She isn't asking for marriage or status. She's asking to be remembered by the man who visited her once, then never again. She knows she's not the only one, but still, she waits. In this culture, sex might be fleeting, but its impact can last forever, carried in a scent, a verse, a memory folded into silk. You sit beneath the same tree as night falls, listening to the wind rustle the paper screens of nearby homes. A man walks silently down the path, his sandals leaving no sound. He disappears behind a door. Tomorrow, we won't speak of it. There will be no announcement, no gossip. Only a line of poetry left on a lacquer tray. Something like, "Your shadow on my pillow lingers longer than the moon." Pleasure here doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't demand. It seduces with restraint. It lives in the pause before the touch, the breath caught between syllables. It's refined, yes, but never cold. It's not less real because it's veiled. If anything, it's more honest than most. It asks you to notice, to listen, to wait. And when it comes, it's not a crash. It's a sigh. You wake to screams, not of passion, not of ecstasy, but fear. The soft perfumes and moonlit poetry of Heian Japan vanish like mist, and you find yourself in a colder, harder time. The air smells of iron and ash, and the world feels thick with accusation. You're in early modern Europe now, somewhere between the 15th and 17th centuries, and sex has taken a turn. Not behind closed doors, not in verse. No, it's on trial. Welcome to the age of witch hunts and whorehouses, where female desire is no longer just misunderstood, it's criminal. You stand in a crowded square, the gallows looming above the heads of a restless, judgment-hungry crowd. At the centre, a woman. Her dress is torn, her feet bare, her eyes locked forward with the expression of someone who knows nothing she says will matter. She's accused of sleeping with demons, of seducing men in their dreams, of using herbs to make herself more desirable. The men who accuse her call her unnatural. The women whisper behind their hands. What no one says aloud is the truth. She had the audacity to own her desire. This is what happens when pleasure becomes fear. Your historical fact. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, Europe saw waves of witch hunts. Tens of thousands of women, and some men, were accused of witchcraft. One of the most common charges, using sex to manipulate or harm. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, explicitly states that women are more likely to be witches because they are carnal by nature and insatiable in lust. Their desire made them dangerous, their bodies suspect, and yes, that fear ran deep. If a woman lived alone, suspicious, too many lovers, witch. No lovers at all, still a witch, clearly hiding something. If she healed with herbs, practiced midwifery, or had too much confidence in her knowledge of the body, she was playing with fire. The fire often won. Now for the fringe fact. In parts of Europe, there was a genuine belief that witches could steal men's genitals. Not metaphorically, literally. Some accounts claimed witches collected them in boxes or kept them as pets. A 16th century man in Germany insisted that his penis had been taken by a woman and hidden in a bird's nest. Was it madness? Mass hysteria? A twisted way to externalize shame? Maybe all three. But the implication was clear. Female power, especially sexual power, was a threat so profound it defied explanation. But here's where the contradictions pile up. Because even as women were being punished for any perceived sexual agency, Europe's cities were brimming with brothels. In London, in Paris, in Florence, houses of pleasure operated with thinly veiled legal tolerance. You walk past one now, the sign subtle, the men not bothering to hide their visits. Inside, women wear rouge, lace, confidence. Some have wigs, some play instruments. They are many things: actors, caretakers, objects, survivors. For some, it's work. For others, it's refuge. None of them get to want. And yet, in this strange overlap of repression and indulgence, desire is everywhere. In secret letters exchanged in back rooms, in paintings hidden behind velvet curtains, In bawdy ballads sung too loudly at taverns, sex sells, yes, but it also spills, leaks out of the corners of the very rules meant to contain it. You read a diary entry from a merchant's wife who writes, "I dreamt again of the stable boy. I said the rosary twice and still feel heat in my cheeks. She's not evil, she's not broken, she's just human in a world terrified of humanity." The debate among historians, whether these witch hunts were about sex at all, or just a convenient excuse for deeper social control. Some say it was about silencing female autonomy, others argue it was about land, wealth, religious conflict. But one truth remains unshaken: sexuality, especially female sexuality, was seen as unpredictable, untamable, and anything untamable needed to be eliminated. You walk through a small village where midwives are banned from administering certain herbs. You find a note pinned to a church door warning husbands to watch their wives closely during the full moon. You hear a man explain that his neighbour's goat died because a widow down the lane looked at it the wrong way. This isn't logic, it's fear. And fear, in this case, has a favourite target: women who do not apologise for their bodies. But in the shadows, resistance grows. You find books written in code, herbals disguised as cookbooks, love spells hidden in embroidery patterns. A group of women gathers in secret to share knowledge, to swap stories, to light candles and remember that they are not alone. They are not witches, or maybe they are, and maybe that word is slowly, painfully, becoming a badge instead of a sentence. At the same time, art begins to shift. You walk through a gallery in Venice and see paintings that suddenly revel in the curve of a back, the tilt of a hip. Women no longer just saints or sinners, but something else. Still objectified, yes, but also seen. The line between worship and voyeurism blurs. Desire becomes brushstroke, silk and shadow and suggestion. In another room, a printing press churns out pamphlets, some scolding, others scandalous. The new technology spreads ideas fast and not all of them wholly. Some advocate for chastity, others for pleasure. You pick up one titled The Honest Courtesan, defending a woman's right to pleasure and wit. It's bold, it's subversive, it's already been banned. Back in the brothel, a woman reclines with a glass of wine, watching a man undress nervously. She isn't afraid, she's amused. She knows this game, knows the power it gives her, for a moment anyway. She might enjoy what comes next, she might not, but it's her choice tonight. That's rare enough to matter. And outside, in the dark alley where someone once hung a noose, a girl kisses another girl and laughs like she isn't afraid. Just once, no one sees. Or if they do, they pretend not to. That too is a beginning. So here you are in a world where pleasure is outlawed, policed, bought and burned. But still, it lives. It lives in coded spells, in velvet paintings, in whispered songs and secret meetings. You've seen desire criminalised and commercialised, but never destroyed. Because even under threat of fire, people still ache, still reach, still find each other, and sometimes, just sometimes, they dare to enjoy it. You wake surrounded by the scent of oil paint, drying plaster, and the unmistakable echo of a choir rehearsal somewhere just beyond a stone archway. You blink against shafts of light filtering through high windows, bouncing off frescoed ceilings and marble floors. You're in Renaissance Italy now, Florence maybe, or Rome, and something is different. Yes, there's still God. Yes, the church looms large. But so does the human body. And not in chains this time, in glory. You've arrived in a world rediscovering the flesh, not to fear it, but to paint it, study it, and maybe adore it. You walk through a studio filled with canvases, half-finished sketches, charcoal nudes, mythic scenes mid-brushstroke. A young man stands before a model, not hiding the fact that she's entirely nude. He's focused, eyes narrowed, brush moving with reverence, not lust, not even desire. This isn't titillation, it's curiosity, worship, a quiet celebration of form. In the Renaissance, the body becomes more than temptation, it becomes truth. Flesh is no longer something to suppress, it's something to understand. Your historical fact: the Renaissance, beginning in the 14th century and blooming across the 15th and 16th, marked a radical shift in how Europeans viewed the human body. Influenced by classical antiquity, artists and scholars returned to studying anatomy, symmetry, and proportion. This wasn't just about medicine, it was about beauty, For the first time in centuries, the naked form was not automatically sinful. It could be divine. After all, God made Adam naked, and Michelangelo made sure everyone remembered it. You pass through the halls of the Medici Palace, where paintings of Venus, the goddess of love, hang beside portraits of saints. No one flinches, no one apologises. Botticelli's Venus stands nude in a seashell, hair cascading over her shoulders like silk spun from moonlight. She's not just beautiful, she's serene, idealised. Sexual, yes, but not vulgar. And this, here, is the Renaissance contradiction. It praises the erotic, as long as it's disguised as allegory. Fringe fact time. Behind the veil of high art, Renaissance artists were also creating deeply sexual works that never made it into the public galleries. Titian, Giulio Romano, and others produced explicit pieces for private patrons, sometimes hidden in drawers or secret rooms. These paintings depicted acts far less mythological than Venus rising from the sea. A little less goddess of love, a little more nude lady on a chaise longue making intense eye contact. Pleasure in oil paint, just, exclusive. And here's the academic tug of war. Did this return to classical beauty actually liberate sexuality, or just dress it up in prettier clothes? Some scholars argue that the Renaissance transformed the way people thought about sex, that it made room for aesthetics, affection, and intellectual attraction. Others point out that despite all the art, society remained deeply patriarchal, and desire still existed mostly on male terms. After all, most of those nudes, women, painted by men, for men. You sit in a courtyard garden where philosophers debate under grapevines. They quote Plato, but also Aristotle, and now even Ficino or Pico della Mirandola, men trying to reconcile the soul and the senses. They speak of platonic love, of divine madness, of how beauty lifts the soul toward God. It all sounds noble, until one of them writes a sonnet that's clearly just about how much he wants to kiss someone's collarbone. And while the elite swirl around in layers of silk, exchanging glances and riddles, the street-level stories are different. You walk into a tavern where a sculptor drinks too much and brags too loudly about the model who inspired his Madonna. His friends laugh, bang mugs on the table, and trade crude jokes about marble breasts and divine thighs. So much for sacred art. Meanwhile, the church remains conflicted. On one hand, it commissions nude sculptures for its cathedrals. On the other, it tightens moral laws around public behaviour. You find a copy of Il Cortegiano, the etiquette guide of the day. It suggests that a proper courtier may write love letters, flirt discreetly, and maybe even have a lover, so long as the affair is subtle, tasteful, and above all socially useful. It's sex by etiquette, aestheticised but controlled. You slip into a small chapel where a choir is practising. The walls are painted with saints, chaste, glowing, eyes lifted to the heavens. But in a side altar, almost hidden, there's a fresco of Mary Magdalene. She's robed, but only just. Her eyes are lowered, her lips parted, her hair loose and golden. It's a strange image, caught between repentance and seduction. And that's exactly the point. Renaissance religious art often fused the spiritual and the sensual. After all, what better way to reach heaven than through longing? In another corner of the city you meet a courtesan, not a prostitute in the street, but a companion to artists, poets, and nobles. She's literate, witty. Dressed in crimson silk and armed with stories, she's slept with 3 dukes and corrected 2 of them on Latin declensions. She knows how to pour wine, recite Virgil, and manipulate desire like a chessboard. And yes, she enjoys herself when she chooses to. You realise she lives in a kind of liminal space, respected and scandalous, envied and condemned. But she owns her body in a way few others here can. Still, outside of the cities, things look more familiar and harsher. In the countryside, sex remains a function. Peasant marriages are practical, swift. Babies arrive early and often. Pleasure is not a topic. But even here, in the quiet corners, you see lovers meeting under olive trees, sharing bread and kisses after the harvest. No poetry, no marble, just heat and breath. The Renaissance may belong to scholars, but desire belongs to everyone. You end your day in the studio of a young painter working by candlelight. His canvas shows a couple, nude, tangled, not mythologized, not posing, just together. His brush slows, and he stares at them like he's seeing something bigger than the figures he's painting. You ask him what he's trying to capture. He says, what it feels like, just for a moment, to want someone and be wanted back. For the first time, it doesn't sound scandalous, or sacred, or political, just human, and that may be the most radical thing the Renaissance has done, made pleasure visible, not perfect, not equal, but no longer unspeakable. Here, for once, to be looked at, and maybe even understood. You wake to silence so stiff it crackles. There's no laughter here, no perfume, no poetry, just hard angles, woolen coats, and a cold wind cutting down a narrow street. Welcome to Puritan New England, where the windows are small, the sermons long, and even thinking about sex can get you exiled, or worse. The Renaissance may have flirted with the idea that the body was a temple, but the Puritans are having none of it. In this world, your body is a problem, and your thoughts, even more dangerous. You walk through Salem, yes, that Salem, its dirt streets frosted with early snow, every house tucked behind a fence like it's hiding something. The people move briskly, their eyes down, their collars high. You hear the clatter of hooves and the call of a preacher from the meeting house steps. His voice is sharp as an axe. He's shouting about sin, temptation, the snares of the devil. He's not talking about murder or theft. He's talking about desire, a glance, a touch, a dream. The flesh is weak, he says, and the devil comes dressed as a woman. That last part lands hard, because in this world, women are walking temptations just by existing. A flash of ankle can cause a scandal. A red ribbon in the hair might lead to whispered accusations. You watch as a teenage girl is pulled aside and scolded for letting her bodice slip, by less than a finger's width. She stands there, shamed into silence, while the men nod solemnly. The girls her age already know that purity isn't about what they do, it's about being impossible to accuse. Your historical fact, the Puritan movement, emerging in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, brought a strict Calvinist theology to England, and later the American colonies. It emphasized predestination, moral discipline, and an intense fear of sin, especially sexual sin. Adultery, fornication, and unclean thoughts were punished not only spiritually, but socially and sometimes legally. In Massachusetts Bay Colony, public whippings for lewd behaviour were a regular spectacle. And yes, those scarlet letters weren't just fiction. Now for the strange, almost surreal fringe fact. In early colonial New England, court records show multiple cases of people being tried not just for sex acts, but for kissing, cuddling, or simply lying too near. One couple in the 1640s was fined for sitting alone on a log in the woods. There was no witness to any indecency, just the possibility that something might have happened. In this era, temptation was considered a sin in itself, which is ironic considering how many of those sermons fixated on the exact details of what you shouldn't be imagining. The open scholarly debate, whether Puritan sexual repression created a uniquely dysfunctional relationship with pleasure, or whether it just formalised the anxieties that had always been there. Some argue that the Puritans weren't anti-sex, just pro-order, that within marriage sex was considered a gift from God. Others insist the movement warped generations with its obsessive focus on chastity and guilt. Either way, this much is clear. In Puritan culture, sex outside of marriage wasn't just immoral, it was a sign you might be damned. You watch a courtship unfold, it's practical. The man is 27, owns some land, and has a decent reputation. The woman is 22, obedient, and skilled in domestic tasks. He brings her a bundle of apples. She nods. He asks permission to bundle, an old practice where a courting couple could sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, under strict observation, usually with a literal board between them. You witness this ritual, the awkward silence, the stiff limbs, the excruciating proximity. They don't even face each other. But this is supposed to help them determine compatibility. You wonder if anyone's actually enjoying themselves or just trying to survive the rules long enough to get a wedding. Even inside marriage, sex remains muted. Acceptable, yes. Necessary even. But pleasure, that's dicey. You read letters between married couples, some affectionate, most logistical. They speak of children, crops, scripture. Rarely, very rarely, does anyone mention want. To want too much is to risk being ungodly. For women especially, expressing sexual desire could be considered unnatural. If you're too eager, you might be a whore. If you're too reserved, a frigid wife, you can't win. Yet despite all this, desire doesn't vanish. It festers. It dreams. You overhear whispers among teenage boys daring each other to peek at the widow by the river who lets her sleeves roll too far. You catch a young woman scribbling a secret letter to a soldier, slipping it into his Bible with trembling fingers. A midwife tells another woman to drink pennyroyal tea, just in case. The official rules are suffocating. The unofficial world hums just beneath the surface. You visit a jail where a woman waits for judgment. She was caught with a man not her husband. No pregnancy, no injury, just presence. Her name will be spoken from the pulpit, her punishment discussed like a lesson. The man, fined and quietly forgotten. The woman, branded. Maybe not literally, but socially. She may never marry. Her children, if she ever has any, will carry her shame. And yet, when you speak to her, she doesn't weep. She says, "He made me feel alive, that's all." You understand more from that sentence than from 1,000 sermons. Outside the village, you find a small group of Quakers meeting in secret. They believe that God speaks directly to everyone, not just the clergy. Their theology is radical, and so is their attitude toward the body. They say the soul doesn't live in the body, it is the body, and that maybe, just maybe, pleasure isn't a sin but a kind of truth. You watch as two of them kiss, tenderly, honestly, with no fear. It's not loud, it's not vulgar, but it is real. You sit by a frozen pond as the moon rises, the village quiet, the wind sharp. Somewhere, a husband and wife lie in bed, side by side, both awake, neither speaking. One wants to reach out but doesn't. The other wants to be touched but won't ask. Tomorrow they'll pray, today they ache. That too is part of this era, wanting without permission. So here you are, surrounded by piety, rigidity, and the endless echo of don'ts. You've seen sex punished, policed, avoided, and buried. And yet, beneath all that cotton and scripture, the human pulse continues. You hear it in stolen glances, in bundled bodies, in the space between two people sitting too close and pretending it means nothing. Pleasure hasn't died, it's just gone quiet, holding its breath, waiting for the next crack in the wall. You wake to laughter, real laughter, rowdy, unashamed, teeth-showing, tavern-shaking laughter. It's night, but the town is very much awake. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, salt, spilled rum and smoke. You're not in a court or a chapel anymore. You're in a port city in the 17th or 18th century, somewhere with a name like Tortuga, Port Royal, or maybe a coastal corner of Lisbon where no one bothers to lock the doors. You've stepped into the underbelly of the Atlantic world, where order exists only when the captain's sober and everyone else is either trying to escape something or trying to feel something. Welcome to the era of pirates, ports and pleasure for hire. You follow the sound of music through winding alleys and right into the belly of a brothel disguised as a tavern. Or maybe it's the other way around. There's a fiddler in the corner, boots stomping on warped wood, mugs slamming, hips swaying, and deals being made in every language you can think of. A sailor and a woman are dancing, spinning faster than the candlelight can keep up, both laughing like they've already forgotten where they're supposed to be tomorrow. The rules here are different, looser, or sometimes non-existent. Morality doesn't hang on the wall like a crucifix, it sloshes in the bottom of a bottle. In this world, sex isn't sacred or sinful. It's just part of the economy. One more exchange in a port town that runs on labour, rum, disease, and the knowledge that death is usually closer than land. The goal isn't purity, it's pleasure, or more often, distraction. Your historical fact: port cities during the height of maritime empires, especially from the 1600s to the 1800s, were hotbeds of commercial sex. Sailors returning from months at sea sought physical contact, while local women, some working independently, others under exploitative conditions, offered it for a price. Brothels flourished in places like Amsterdam, London's East End, and Caribbean ports like Port Royal. Some cities even had official red light districts. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. And for the fringe fact, in certain pirate crews it wasn't uncommon for same-sex pairings to form, relationships called matelotage in the French-speaking Caribbean. These bonds could be emotional, romantic, financial, or all three. Some historians argue they were akin to informal marriages. Partners shared loot, rooms, even burial wishes. And in a life where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, such bonds offered more than pleasure, they offered loyalty. Of course, the scholarly debate here is less about whether sex was present, it was, loudly, and more about how much autonomy anyone really had. Were brothel workers choosing this life, or was it the only option left in a brutal, classist, often colonial economy? Some sources suggest certain women gained wealth and power through their work, especially if they owned their establishments, or knew how to play clients against one another. Others were trafficked, coerced, or discarded once their usefulness faded. The line between agency and exploitation remains thin and shifting, blurred by time and rum-soaked archives. You spend the night drifting between tavern tables and back rooms, where everyone seems to want something. Sometimes money, sometimes affection, sometimes just the illusion of being touched by someone who sees them. You watch as a British officer pays for an hour with a woman who looks no older than 17. She barely speaks. He doesn't notice, or care. Two sailors share a kiss behind the dock warehouse, their hands greedy and familiar. No one stops them. No one blinks. In another corner, an older woman in a velvet dress counts coins while listening to two young workers complain about a French captain's refusal to pay. She's not just the madam here, she's the boss. She decides who gets a bed, who gets a meal, and who gets kicked out. Her girls respect her, fear her too. She was once them. Now she writes the rules, even if they're still built on sand. And yet, amid the grime and transactional sweat, there are flashes of something real. You hear laughter from a room upstairs, not faked, not performed, but deep guttural amusement between two people who've stumbled into a strange kind of joy. Down below, a pirate with a missing eye is writing a letter by candlelight, trying to spell out how he misses someone back in Barbados. Her left dimple, he writes, makes me forget cannon fire. He pays someone to deliver it and tucks a flower between the pages, because even here, with all the bought touch and temporary nights, real feelings keep slipping through. And that's the messy truth of this place. Sex is everywhere, but so is longing. You meet a woman who's been with hundreds of men, but only remembers two, the ones who asked her name first. A man tells you he doesn't mind paying, as long as the girl smiles like she means it. You realise how rare that must be. There are diseases, of course, pox and fever and worse. The brothel keeps a tin of dried herbs they call cleansing powder, passed from girl to girl with a knowing look. You meet a surgeon who treats both cannon wounds and syphilis with the same brutal indifference. They all rot, he says, just in different spots. But in the same breath you hear sea shanties about lovers lost and found, ballads sung with salt in the throat and bruises on the knuckles. Desire here may be dirty, but it's not cold. It comes with heat, with sweat, with bruises that fade and stories that don't. You watch a ship leave at dawn, ropes creaking, sailors waving. A woman stands at the dock watching until it's gone. She's not crying, she's not romanticising. She just knows he won't write. They never do. But she remembers how he whispered her name like it was the last word in a prayer. By mid-morning another ship docks, new faces, new stories. The cycle continues. Sex as survival, sex as escape, sex as routine, and somewhere, buried in all of it, sex as connection. Raw, quick, possibly meaningless, and yet deeply human. Here, in the noisy, rotting, unwashed world of the port, pleasure isn't refined or idealised. It's scraped together, spent quickly, and sometimes, by accident, shared honestly. No saints, no poetry, just need, met for a moment. And in a way, that's its own kind of purity. You wake to powdered wigs, clinking glasses, and the hum of ideas bouncing off polished wood-panelled walls. Welcome to the 18th century Enlightenment salon, where pleasure now wears a waistcoat and quotes Voltaire. The air is thick with pipe smoke, perfume, and smug certainty. You've arrived at a moment when people have decided the body, after centuries of shame, superstition, and scarlet letters, is due for some rational investigation. The mind has taken centre stage, but the body? Oh, it's still lurking in the wings, smirking. You're in Paris tonight, or maybe London, or possibly Vienna. The setting's always the same, some aristocrat's drawing room, warm with candlelight and the gentle clatter of silver teaspoons. Around you are philosophers, scientists, poets, and the occasional libertine trying to behave long enough to get through dessert. They're debating the rights of man, the perfectibility of society, the movement of celestial bodies, and then, quite suddenly, someone brings up masturbation. The room tilts, Your historical fact: the Enlightenment, spanning the 17th and 18th centuries, ushered in a wave of scientific curiosity and philosophical inquiry, including a renewed interest in human anatomy, psychology, and sexuality. Writers like Rousseau, Diderot, and even Kant all weighed in, awkwardly, hesitantly, sometimes hilariously, on sex. For the first time, pleasure was being examined as a natural part of human life, something not just to be feared or idolised but understood, and let's just say the results were mixed. You sit beside a physician eagerly explaining how female pleasure is rooted in biology, a faint echo of the male orgasm, he says confidently, as if he's personally experienced both. He talks about nerves and hysteria like he's naming forest creatures. Across from him, a philosopher argues that sex without reason is animalistic, but that denying it altogether is as contrary to nature. Everyone nods, sipping their wine like they didn't all just flinch internally. Because here's the Enlightenment's great contradiction. They want to liberate the mind, but the body still embarrasses them. Pleasure is real. They all know it. But it must be kept, tidy, discussed in Latin, wrapped in layers of metaphor, science, and social rules. God might be retreating from centre stage, but he's been replaced by reputation, which in salons like this might be even more punishing. Let's get to the fringe fact, which honestly deserves its own plaque. By the mid-17th century, onanism, a term for masturbation borrowed from the biblical onan, had become a full-blown medical panic. Doctors and pamphleteers warned that self-pleasure could cause blindness, insanity, spinal decay, and moral ruin. One particularly dramatic treatise claimed that boys who masturbated would dribble like a broken bottle and fade to ghost before 25. The hysteria didn't stop people from doing it, obviously. It just made them terrified about it afterward. A preview of the modern guilt spiral. And here's the ongoing academic debate. Did the Enlightenment free sexuality from the church, or just rebrand repression in fancier language? Sure, people were talking about sex more openly, but that didn't mean they were more comfortable with it. Female pleasure was still misunderstood, and desire, especially outside of marriage, was pathologized more often than it was celebrated. Pleasure existed, but only under the microscope, and the microscope came with opinions. You follow a well-dressed gentleman down the steps of a salon into the street. He's headed to a house on the Seine where the wine is cheaper and the conversation less theoretical. Inside, it's a different world. Mirrors, velvet drapes, and courtesans who speak 5 languages and know when to laugh and when not to. These women are sharp, trained, not just sex workers, but conversationalists, hostesses, even advisors to powerful men. They know how to play the game, and sometimes, yes, they enjoy it, but only when no one's watching too closely. You meet one named Sylvie, who tells you, half in jest, half in weary truth, that the best lovers are the ones who think they're philosophers. They ask permission too often, she sighs, but at least they ask. She says she once had a client who quoted Rousseau while tying her corset. He thought it was seduction. I thought it was a headache. But she liked him anyway. At least he listened when she spoke. In the back of the brothel you find something strange. A small printing press. It's spitting out pages of an anonymous erotic novella, bound in cheap covers and sold in back alleys. The Enlightenment may be writing Emile and the Social Contract, but it's also writing Thérèse Philosophe, a shockingly explicit philosophical erotica that mixes theology, sex, and politics into one sticky, subversive little package. People devour these books like candy. You realise that while the salons debate reason, the people are already 3 chapters deep into libertine realism. But even within these pages, pleasure is complicated, often punished, often fatal. Female characters discover their sexuality only to die tragically, or be punished into submission. There's freedom here, yes, but it still comes with consequences. 1 step forward, 2 candlelit steps back. At a public lecture, you hear a young man read from a medical treatise about the female body and its passions. He uses words like convulsions and vapours, and mispronounces clitoris. The audience claps politely. You meet a woman afterward who mutters, "He's never touched one in his life." She's a widow. Her husband died in debt, but left her a collection of books on anatomy and desire. "I've been educating myself," she says with a sly smile. Turns out the body is not a puzzle box. It's more like a poem. You don't solve it, you read it. And that's the quiet revolution brewing beneath all this powdered reason. People, especially women, starting to reclaim their right to feel, not just to theorize or obey or submit, but to want. You visit a small gathering hosted by a woman writer who serves tea and copies of her latest essay on the sympathy of touch. She talks about how physical connection is not beneath reason, but part of it, how touch can be intelligent, how pleasure, when chosen, is a form of knowing. That night, back in the salon, the topic turns to love, not the classical restrained kind, messy love. Someone quotes a line from Rousseau about the natural man, and everyone pretends to understand it, but no one quite knows what to say when an older woman at the table leans forward and asks, "And when does the natural woman get to speak for herself?" The room goes quiet, not hostile, just stunned, like they've been reading the wrong book all along. So here you are, in an age that claims to be enlightened, tiptoeing through the minefield of mind and body. Pleasure has stepped into the conversation at last, but it still hasn't been offered a seat at the table, at least not openly. It waits behind closed doors, behind pseudonyms, behind hands trembling with ink and risk. But it's closer now. No longer a whisper, not yet a roar. But it's starting to speak in complete sentences. You wake to wheels clattering over cobblestones, steam hissing in the distance, and a world suddenly moving faster than anyone seems prepared for. Factories belch smoke into the dawn, chimneys choke the sky, and the street is alive with motion. Carriages, carts, and people rushing like they've just remembered they're late for something important. You're in the thick of the Industrial Revolution now, somewhere in 19th century England, though honestly it could be Manchester, Birmingham, or a dozen other cities just like it. Everything is louder, dirtier, more crowded, and somewhere underneath all of it, pleasure is being boxed up, priced, and mass-produced. You step into a cramped row house where 5 families share a water pump and 3 square feet of privacy. The walls are thin, the bed's overused, and the idea of sex is less about longing and more about survival. You hear it behind the walls at night, quiet, tired, rushed. Sometimes it's tender, sometimes it isn't. But no one talks about it. Not here. Because even as society industrializes, sex is still stuck in Victorian wallpaper, hidden behind respectability, buried under corsets, collars, and a whole lot of denial. Your historical fact. The Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, is often portrayed as sexually repressive, and in many ways it was. The upper and middle classes enforced strict moral codes around marriage, chastity, and propriety. Public displays of affection were frowned upon, and women were expected to be the guardians of virtue, pale, delicate, and disinterested in pleasure. Meanwhile, men were allowed, even expected, to have needs. The result? An entire culture where female desire was either pathologized or completely erased. And here's the bitterly ironic fringe fact. While Victorians were preaching purity, London had one of the highest concentrations of sex workers in the Western world. Estimates suggest that in the mid-1800s, there were as many as 80,000 prostitutes in the city. They stood on corners, worked in disorderly houses, or met clients in shadowy alleys. Some were independent, but many were trapped by poverty, violence, or addiction. The double standard wasn't subtle. Men paid for what they punished others for having, and the scholarly debate? It centres on whether the Victorian obsession with purity actually created more sexual repression, or just shoved it deeper underground. Some argue the era was full of coded expressions of desire, erotic photography, racy novels, and medical case studies disguised as morality tales. Others insist that repression was real, internalised, and damaging, especially for women who were told that to want was to be unwell. Terms like female hysteria became catch-all diagnoses for anything from sexual frustration to postpartum depression. The cure? Sometimes a polite pelvic massage by a doctor. So, yes, that happened. You walk into a physician's office where a woman sits, hands folded, eyes hollow. She says she feels anxious, that her body aches, that she can't sleep. The doctor doesn't ask about her marriage, her loneliness, or whether she's ever been allowed to touch someone without shame. He prescribes a bath, a tonic, and another visit next week. She doesn't know what she wants. She only knows she's not allowed to say it out loud. Then there's the factory girl, 16, working 12 hours a day, hands raw from thread, back bent. She meets a boy behind the mill during lunch. They don't talk much, just enough. It's not a love story, not really, but they kiss. He slips his hand under her apron and she lets him, because for once no one is watching. For once there's no supervisor or preacher or older sister hovering like a moral fog. For once she gets to choose, even if it's brief. You move through different layers of the city. In the parlours of the wealthy, married couples sleep in separate beds and send each other polite notes through servants. Sex exists, but it's scheduled, expected, rarely enjoyed. Wives bear children. Husbands discreetly visit mistresses or seek release in brothels lit by gas lamps and false promises. Everything is dressed up to look cleaner than it is. Yet in those very same homes, locked in drawers and wrapped in ribbons, are copies of Venus in Furs, The Pearl and other scandalous novels printed anonymously and passed hand to hand. You find one, dog-eared and stained, under a widow's mattress. She reads it slowly, one hand resting just beneath the covers. She doesn't believe she's wicked. She just wants to feel something. You attend a spiritualist gathering, a séance, candles flickering, voices trembling. Women especially find power here. Mediums, channelers, prophetesses. Because in a world that tells them to be silent, the spirit world gives them permission to speak, even scream. You realise something odd. For many women, sexuality has been rerouted through mysticism. The body isn't theirs, but the soul, that's harder to police. In the dark, as the table shakes and everyone holds hands, someone moans. No one mentions it afterward. Back in the streets, you find a woman named Mary running what she calls a boarding house, but which everyone knows is a brothel. She has rules. No beatings, no drunkards, and the girls keep a cut. She was born in the slums, worked her way up, and now wears lace and carries a small pistol in her corset. Men don't scare me, she says, lighting a pipe. They bore me mostly, but every now and then one surprises me. And somewhere across the city Oscar Wilde is writing about love that dares not speak its name. His work, cloaked in wit and metaphor, pulses with forbidden longing. Homosexuality, illegal and dangerous, exists only in shadows and coded glances. Still, men find each other. Women too. Behind closed doors, beneath whispers. Through entire lives conducted in hints and half-truths. You find a single mother with 4 children, lighting candles for the husband who never came home. She hasn't touched anyone in 3 years, but sometimes when the children are asleep, she slips her hand between her thighs and remembers. Not him, just herself. What she felt, what she misses. She doesn't feel guilty, she feels alive. This era doesn't lack pleasure. It just buries it under 100 layers of soot, silk, shame and sermons. It paints over it in watercolours and locks it behind lace curtains, but still it pulses. In factory corners, in drawing rooms, in cheap novels and dirty alleyways. Pleasure hasn't disappeared. It's just learned how to wait, how to whisper, how to light one candle at a time in a world terrified of fire. You wake to the sharp smell of ink and sweat, to cobblestone streets flooded with protest chants, and to 1,000 pamphlets being handed out by gloved fingers and bare fists alike. The year is somewhere near the early 20th century, close enough for you to hear the faint buzz of electricity, but still far from air conditioning or cultural comfort. You're in a world beginning to fracture, stretch, and demand answers. And sex, once whispered through keyholes and pressed between poetry pages, is now marching in the streets, arm in arm with suffrage, socialism, and something dangerous, choice. You're in Berlin first, bright, roaring, pulsing Berlin of the 1920s. Smoke curls from long cigarette holders, jazz stumbles from radios, and somewhere, someone's painting a woman dressed like a man, sitting with her legs open, daring you to blink first. You step into a nightclub where gender is fluid, love is loud, and everything respectable society fears is on full display. Laughing, dancing, demanding more light. This is the Weimar Republic in full swing, fractured, scandalised, electrified. Your historical fact. The early 20th century saw the first real cracks in the Victorian moral order. Across Europe and North America, movements for women's suffrage, workers' rights, and sexual liberation began gaining ground. In Germany, figures like Magnus Hirschfeld, founder of the Institute for Sexual Research, advocated for LGBTQ rights and studied sexuality scientifically, not as sin or sickness, but as a spectrum. Freud, meanwhile, was busy dragging unconscious desire into daylight, insisting that sex wasn't just a problem, it was the engine of the human psyche. And then, the fringe fact that feels almost too modern to be true. In the 1920s, Berlin had vending machines that dispensed condoms and sexual health information. Think about that. While other countries were still debating whether women should even learn about their bodies, Berliners were walking down the street and buying birth control from machines. Not in secret, not in shame, just there. Practical. Public. Almost boring. Almost. But here's where the debate flares. Some scholars argue that these roaring 20s were less a breakthrough and more a fever dream. A brief, dazzling moment before the backlash came. Others say the roots of modern sexual freedom were planted here, watered with art, scandal and defiance. But even in these liberated pockets, power imbalances remained. Prostitution still thrived, by choice, necessity and coercion. Women could vote in some countries now, but could still lose their jobs for being improper. And queerness, while celebrated in places like Berlin, was still criminalised elsewhere. You watch a young woman step into a small, smoky lecture hall. She's a nurse by day, a sex educator by night. Her pamphlet reads, "The female body, yours to know." She speaks plainly, names parts no one's supposed to name. She passes around diagrams. Some women giggle, others cry, one simply stares. Because for the first time someone has said, your body belongs to you, not to God, not to your husband, not to your country. You. You walk through the tenement halls of New York's Lower East Side, where immigrant girls are learning English and factory math, and also what to say if a man in the elevator reaches for their waist. You see birth control activist Margaret Sanger being arrested for mailing information about contraception, labelled obscene material. She smiles in her mugshot like a woman who's already thinking 3 steps ahead. Elsewhere, in Paris, artists are sketching lovers in poses still banned in 3 countries. You see Gertrude Stein throwing salons where queer writers drink wine and debate syntax while holding hands under the table. You find Virginia Woolf walking a garden path thinking about bodies as metaphors and about what it means to want without needing to apologise. But it's not all poetry and parties. You visit a maternity ward in a poorer district where girls no older than 16 deliver their 3rd child. Their husbands wait outside, chain-smoking. A nurse whispers that the girl nearly bled out last time, but there's no money for a doctor, let alone birth control. Pleasure? No. These girls don't know what it means to want. They know what it means to be used. By tradition, by poverty, by silence. And yet, in the cracks, something stirs. You sit in a tiny cinema in Moscow where a Soviet film quietly promotes gender equality. You find a lesbian couple in Chicago pretending to be roommates, holding hands beneath patchwork quilts and daring to dream of more than coded glances. You find a letter, never sent, from a young man in the British Army to another soldier, folded 12 times and tucked in a journal. "Your laugh made me forget where we were," it reads. He signs it. Always. Maybe. You visit Hirschfeld's Institute in Berlin, part clinic, part library, part refuge. Trans people find treatment here. Gay men come for protection, for paperwork, for community. There are parties, yes, but also research, resistance, hope. It feels fragile, like a soap bubble floating through gunpowder. You're not wrong. Within a decade, the Institute will be stormed by Nazis, books burned, files destroyed, people vanished. Because that's the thing about progress. It moves forward, but it also provokes. For every step toward freedom, there's a backlash of fear, dressed as morality, wielding laws and violence. You see it already. Articles warning that modern women are ruining the family, that queerness is contagious, that too much pleasure leads to chaos. The old fears never die. They just rebrand. And yet, here you are, watching a drag performer in a Berlin cabaret toss their boa into the crowd, wink at a married man, and blow a kiss at a woman who claps until her gloves tear. You sit beside a girl in a bomber jacket and slacks, who tells you she wants to fly planes and kiss women and never wear a corset again. You pass a newspaper headline calling all of this decadence. The girl shrugs and says, "Maybe, but it's mine." Pleasure in this era is loud, political, sometimes dangerous. It's no longer hiding, it's marching, carrying signs, writing manifestos, dancing in forbidden places. It's messy and uneven and not always kind, but it's trying. trying to belong to the people who feel it, not the ones who want to control it. And for the first time, the question isn't just whether pleasure exists, it's who gets to define it. You wake to the whir of machines, the low hum of fluorescent lights, and the smell of metal, ink, and rubber. The century has flipped, the wars have scarred, and now it's the mid-20th century, modernity in full swing. Factories have multiplied, cities have swelled, and everything, including sex, is supposed to be cleaner, smarter, and more efficient. You're in America, probably, but it could just as easily be post-war Britain or booming post-industrial Japan. It's the age of the nuclear family, the picket fence, the two-car garage, and the deep gnawing suspicion that everyone's pretending just a little too hard. Here on the surface everything seems polished. The ads say it all, women vacuum in pearls, men grill steaks with pride, and children ride bicycles down perfectly paved streets. But open a bathroom cabinet and you'll find pamphlets about feminine hygiene that hint, ever so vaguely, at something deeper. Step into a psychiatrist's office and you'll find a man flipping through Kinsey's reports, frowning over the data, wondering what it means that nearly half the country is doing things they're not supposed to even talk about. Your historical fact: Alfred Kinsey, a zoologist turned sexologist, shook America to its core in 1948 and 1953 with the publication of the Kinsey Reports. These massive surveys on male and female sexuality revealed that Americans were having far more diverse and frequent sexual experiences than the culture admitted. Masturbation, common. Same-sex experiences, more frequent than expected. Premarital sex, basically the norm. Kinsey's work exposed a massive gap between public morality and private behaviour. People weren't prudes, they were just performing prudeness. But that performance was powerful. You visit a neighbourhood where every house looks like the one before it. Identical lawns, identical smiles, identical lies. You hear a wife ask her friend over coffee whether it's normal to not enjoy it with her husband. The friend blinks, then says, "It's not supposed to be about us." They both laugh a little too quickly. Here's your fringe fact. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association officially listed homosexuality as a mental disorder. Not a variation, not a preference, a disorder. That label would stay in place for over 2 decades, and its effects rippled through families, workplaces, churches, and classrooms. People were institutionalized, fired, shamed, cured. But still, secretly, quietly, joyfully, people kept loving who they loved. The debate that still ties scholars in knots is whether this was a time of repression or redefinition. On one hand, yes, sex was channeled into strict gender roles, policed by religion, medicine, and media. On the other, people were starting to ask harder questions about marriage, about pleasure, about whether the scripts they'd been handed were worth following. After all, when Kinsey started pulling back the curtain, the audience didn't riot. They leaned in closer. You visit a women's magazine editorial room in 1960. A young writer pitches a column about orgasms. The editor, wearing cat-eye glasses and holding a pencil like a dagger, says, "Not unless you mean his." But the girl writes it anyway, slips it into a different section. It runs under the title, "How to Make Marriage More Fulfilling." Everyone knows what it's really about. And then you hear it. The click of a plastic case opening. The sound of a pill rolling into a hand. The birth control pill, approved in 1960, quietly explodes everything. For the first time in modern history, a woman can separate sex from reproduction, with something small enough to fit in her purse. Churches panic. Politicians warn of moral collapse. Women smile. They've heard this before. In a college dorm room, you meet a group of girls passing around a copy of The Feminine Mystique like it's contraband. One of them has underlined the sentence, "The problem that has no name." They don't know what to call it yet, but they feel it. The frustration, the pressure, the ache to be more than someone else's wife, someone else's mother. They're not rejecting love. They're just starting to wonder if they've ever really chosen it freely. Meanwhile, in basements and clubs across the country, gay and lesbian communities are forming. Underground, but undeniable. You go to a house party where everyone is dancing to Motown and watching the windows for cops. One man tells you he had to marry a woman just to keep his job. Another woman says she hasn't spoken to her mother since coming out. But then someone turns the volume up, and they all keep dancing. Because even when society slams the door, people find ways to turn up the music. You meet a man who fought in World War II, came home, married, had 3 kids, and has never once felt like he was allowed to want. I did everything right, he says, and it still doesn't feel like me. He looks at you with the hollow confusion of a man who's lived according to the rules and somehow still lost the game. But the cracks are getting wider. The beats write about sex in smoky jazz clubs. Hugh Hefner launches Playboy with the philosophy that men should be able to enjoy sex and literature. The lines are blurry. The contradictions are constant. You see a preacher rail against sin in the morning and quietly visit a sex worker that night. A housewife who sneaks romance novels behind cookbooks. A teenager with a notebook full of things he'll never say out loud. You realise something odd. Pleasure is no longer just about bodies. It's about identities. Who's allowed to enjoy, who's allowed to say no, who writes the script, and who dares to rewrite it. And right now, that rewrite is slow, clumsy, and often interrupted. But it's happening. You end your day in a living room where a young couple is watching television. She rests her head on his shoulder. They're married, safe, expected. But under the glow of the screen, she whispers, "Do you think it could be more than this?" He doesn't laugh. He just says, "I hope so." Because this era isn't about wild freedom or complete repression. It's about tension, between what's real and what's allowed, between desire and design. It's the moment before the match hits the fuse, and everyone's holding their breath. You wake to static on a TV screen, the glow of neon through dusty blinds, and the familiar buzz of a phone left vibrating on the nightstand. The century has flipped again, but this time it didn't ask permission. You're now firmly in the late 20th and early 21st century, the era of the internet, of hookup apps, of 10,000 self-help books, promising to teach you how to orgasm, commit, detach, or do all three simultaneously without spilling your oat milk latte. Welcome to the modern world, where pleasure isn't hiding anymore. It's been monetized, optimized, and maybe, just maybe, overexposed. You sit in a subway car under an ad for pelvic floor trainers, next to someone swiping left with clinical disinterest. Sex is everywhere now, in song lyrics, sitcom punchlines, skincare commercials, but somehow it all feels muted. Like we've talked about it so much, the words have worn thin. We joke about thirst traps, polycules, trauma bonds, and doing the work, but beneath it all, the same ancient questions still hum. What do you want? Who gets to want? Does wanting still matter? Your historical fact. By the end of the 20th century, two revolutions had reshaped the sexual landscape. The sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, and the digital revolution of the 1990s and 2000s. The first challenged moral norms around sex, gender, and relationships, fueled by feminism, queer liberation, and civil rights. The second cracked the world wide open. Suddenly, porn was free. Identities were fluid. You could text a stranger at midnight and be naked in their apartment 20 minutes later, still unsure if you remembered their name. And now, the fringe fact. In 2001, a Japanese company developed a robot designed specifically for human companionship. Emotional, conversational, and yes, sexual. By 2023, full-body AI-enabled sex robots were not just prototypes but products, complete with customizable personalities and heating features. Some were marketed to people with disabilities, others, just lonely men with money. The question no one wants to answer honestly: at what point does intimacy become just another subscription? The debate today is no longer about whether pleasure exists. That argument's been settled. Now it's about whether pleasure is still pleasurable. Scholars and critics ask, has the pursuit of gratification become too transactional, too disembodied, too self-referential? When sex is always on offer, is it still a revelation, or just another item in your Amazon cart? You sit in a therapist's office with a couple who've been married 8 years. They love each other. They communicate. They've read the books, listened to the podcasts, tried mutual calendars and kink workshops, and scheduled intimacy nights. But they haven't touched in 6 months. They're not broken, just tired. It's not that I don't want him, she says, it's just everything feels like a performance, like I'm supposed to know how this works by now, and I still don't. You nod, because that's the ache of this era, the pressure to get it right, to be simultaneously casual and transcendent, empowered and chill, vulnerable and hot. There's an algorithm for everything now except real desire. You walk through a college campus where students discuss consent the way previous generations discuss safe driving. It's essential, respected, and treated with the seriousness it deserves. Finally. And yet, when asked how often they feel joy during sex, many hesitate. Not because it isn't happening, but because no one taught them how to recognise it, or ask for it, or pause long enough to feel it before posting the story. You pass a pride parade where flags stretch into the sky, and teenagers dance with glitter on their faces and they-them pins on their chests. It's beautiful, loud, and unashamed. You also hear a man on the corner mutter something ugly under his breath. The world has changed, but not evenly, not everywhere. There are still laws waiting to roll back rights, still churches preaching shame with a smile, still families refusing to use the right names, and still, somehow, people dancing anyway. You sit across from a woman in her 60s, divorced, rediscovering herself through therapy, hiking, and Tinder. I thought sex ended at 50, she says, sipping wine. Turns out it just got better. She smiles, unapologetic. I'm finally doing it for me. She pulls out her phone and shows you a text thread with someone named Carla. She's kind, she says, and she asks me what I like. She looks stunned just saying it aloud. And then you're with a teenager in a small town, sitting alone in their room, scrolling through forums. They've never kissed anyone, but they've read about every kind of relationship model, every orientation, every vocabulary word you can imagine. They're scared. But they're also hopeful. Because knowledge has replaced isolation. Because one day, maybe, they'll get to write their own story, not copy someone else's. You visit a conference on sex tech where engineers discuss vibrators that respond to biometric data and virtual partners that learn your preferences over time. It's impressive, innovative, also kind of sad, because you can't help wondering, in all this evolution, what's been lost? Is intimacy still about two people, or just one with really good Wi-Fi? But then you find them. The couple lying in bed, still in their clothes, laughing too hard to get undressed. The two friends who realise they're more than friends, even though they've tried so hard not to be. The woman in her studio apartment who locks the door, lights a candle, and finally gives herself permission to enjoy being alone. The single dad who tells his kid that love doesn't have to look any particular way, and means it. The queer elder who gets their first kiss at 72 and cries without shame. Because for all the noise, for all the overexposure and contradiction and burnout, pleasure hasn't disappeared. It's still showing up in stolen glances, awkward conversations, midnight confessions, and brave first touches. It's quieter now. Less about climax, more about connection. You've travelled from sacred groves to silicon chips, from ancient rituals to emojis, from silenced desire to viral thirst traps. And the truth is, pleasure never needed a rebrand. It needed to be reclaimed. So here you are, back in your own body, in your own time. The world still confused, still reaching, still fumbling towards something honest. Sex is no longer just an act. It's a mirror, a question, a place where power, vulnerability, longing and laughter all crash into each other and ask, what if this could feel good, and be good, for both of us? You take a breath, you close your eyes, and tomorrow you try again. So now you're here, settled under the blankets, your eyes a little heavier, your breath quieter than before. You've crossed thousands of years tonight, walked through temples and tenements, whispered alongside saints and sex workers, stood quietly in salons, streets and bedrooms that pulsed with 1,000 unspoken wants. And somewhere along the way, you started to realise, pleasure has never been just about the act. It's been about agency, the right to feel, to choose, to ask, to say no, to say yes, fully. It's always been more complicated than desire alone. Bodies carry history, and history leaves fingerprints. Shame, power, survival. They've all shaped what sex meant before anyone ever dared use words like pleasure out loud. You've seen it repurposed for gods, for kings, for contracts and conquests. You've seen it called sin, then science, then self-care. And through it all, you've watched people, ordinary people, trying to carve out some space for softness. Some room to say, this is mine. So maybe now you understand why it matters, why untangling sex from silence is still ongoing, why pleasure, real, chosen, mutual pleasure, is still radical in a world that's constantly trying to regulate the body and the soul. You made it. Through all the awkward metaphors, the medical guesswork, the courtship rituals, the revolutions, the repression, and the messy, beautiful, still unfolding now. And even if no one gets it perfect, because no one ever will, you get to hold this truth. That pleasure has always existed, even when they said it didn't. Especially when they said it didn't. Now pull the blanket up a little tighter. Let the hum of the fan settle your thoughts. The body, after all, is tired from travelling, but your mind, that gets to dream.